أنا جاهز.
Okay, just a few more minutes. I think we're almost ready. Okay, hi Andrew. I think we I think we figured everything now. How are
آه،
you? المفروض خلاص خلينا نتأكد منه. Okay, apologies for a slight delay. I welcome all of you for our night, relative to the night in Palestine sessions of the second day of the Engineering, Destruction, Militarization, and the War Economy Conference, which is held in partnership between the Arab Council for the Social Sciences, Security in Context, the National Pedagogical University in Colombia, and the Ibrahim Abu Lughod Institute at Birzeit University. So just to let our guests here know that we are also live streaming this event on the Birzeit University's YouTube channel, as well as Facebook pages. There is a possibility to use interpretation. We have translators here with us who will be able to translate from and into English and Arabic. So you can just use the word sign, the interpretation sign below to change the language. So today is actually an honor to welcome our colleague and friend, Professor Andrew Ross, who was actually supposed to be in person with us until the conference was delayed and rescheduled after the Israeli regime launched an attack on Iran. We're very glad to have Professor Andrew Ross with us, albeit online, and we definitely do hope to have an opportunity to have him amongst us in person at Birzeit University and in Palestine. So just before I give the word to Andrew Ross is a professor of social and cultural analysis at NYU, New York University, where he's also the director of the Prison Research Lab. He's a frequent contributor to numerous outlets and media outlets. And he's the author of and editor of more than 25 books, including Stonemen, The Palestinians Who Built Israel, and most recently, Abolition Labor, The Fight to End Prison Labor. He is also the co-founder of numerous movement groups, and is currently serving on the National Steering Committee of the Faculty and Staff for Justice in Palestine Network. Professor Andrew, it's an honor to have you with us, and please.
Shukran, Basil. Masa al-khair. Hello, everybody. Marhaba. Assalamu alaikum. This is a very, very difficult time for us to meet. Many of our comrades have been rendered speechless by the daily sight of people being starved to death in front of our eyes. For the rest of us, we must speak and continue to speak and to listen. And this conference is part of that. So thank you, Basil, and the other conference organizers for making sure that this happened. Let me begin with prisons. As Walid Daka once said, for Palestinians, there is a small prison, the Israeli prisons where he and other martyrs have languished and died. And then there's a big prison, all of Palestinian society. And then we might add, there are the other kinds of prisons where many of us have found ourselves when we speak up for Palestine. Now, as it happens, every week I teach at a men's prison 2 hours north of New York City. This prison is classified as medium security, but everything there is fairly low tech. There's a razor wire perimeter fence, a reception desk with a sign-in pen, a little plastic flower on top. There is no body screening, and my escort around the prison is by an officer armed only with a key for opening doors, just as they did in the Tower of London more than 1,000 years ago. By contrast, my academic workplace at New York University has come to resemble a high-tech garrison. It has walled-off common spaces, squads of security personnel posted in every corner, armed with tablets for collecting IDs. There's an upgraded surveillance infrastructure in most buildings, and a thicket of new and repressive rules on speech and conduct with stiff punishments for violations. To clear my travel to the conference back in June, my request was handled by a new NYU office called the Global Security Operations Unit. I'm not kidding. The Global Security Unit did not approve my travel, but they did not deny it. And so I flew out on June the 12th to attend the conference, only for the airplane to have to turn around in mid-flight when the Israeli state launched missiles at Iran. Earlier this year, I was arrested during a protest in the college library and declared persona non grata, which meant that I was barred from entering campus buildings for a while. And in general, tapping or swiping into these buildings allows campus police to know my and my colleagues' location at all times. So here's my question. Why should my university feel more like a fortified military facility than the prison? that I also teach in. In New York, at least, it wasn't until 9/11 that you had to show ID in general to enter buildings. And now it's more routine for our personal data to be digitally captured by some doorman's device, while facial recognition technology typically adds an additional level of surveillance. But the adoption of these advanced surveillance features on my college campus is much more recent. And let's be clear, it is not a response to any perceived security threats. Everyone knows it has much more to do with the protests against the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the violent land theft in West Bank, thousands of miles away. Now, many of us doing solidarity work in the US over the last 20 months have noted the similarity between our garrison campuses and the techniques deployed in the Israeli security apparatus and carceral geography. These links are even more amplified since the full force of the federal state here has descended on our colleges to conduct what they call ideological deportations, ostensibly in the name of fending off the imaginary specter of anti-Semitism or of protecting the joint interests of the US and Israel. The security technology transfer between these two nations obviously deserves more commentary. Some speakers at the conference have already addressed this. I'll also do so shortly. But first, I want to acknowledge the very strong historical legacy in the US of the Cold War University. Its formation dates from the 1950s when the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, decided to launder its military research and development through college campuses. This fateful decision seeded the massive post-war expansion of higher education in the US, but it also gave rise, among other compromised consequences, to the dry apologia of physicists, for example, who would say, we only create the bombs, we don't drop them. Administrators who accepted these lavish inputs of federal dollars to conduct this research and development thereby entangled their universities with the national security apparatus, leaving very little daylight between the collegiate research arms and the warfare state itself, while expanding Washington's reach into new academic disciplines, statecraft-friendly disciplines such as communication studies, development studies, and the entire suite of regional area studies, including, of course, Middle Eastern studies. In the field of superpower competition, Russia and China followed the US model, but no other country has come so close to surpassing it as Israel through the intimate alliance between its universities, its permanent war economy, and its security technology export trade. So the legacy of American higher education's central role in innovating weapons of mass destruction, along with other forms of soft academic power, has been fully exposed most recently during the campus crackdowns on dissent among our community. Our educated youth disclosed, divest. The leading chant of the Palestinian Solidarity student movement is directly aimed at the investment of universities in this arms industry, and especially in weapons destined for reigning war on Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Iran. The list seems to go on and on. And not surprisingly, then, the most common frame of historical reference for the recent repression has been the Red Scare of the McCarthy era. Even though the record of terminations and suspensions of professors, not to mention students, over the last decade has been much longer and deeper than was the case during that early Cold War period. We've heard a lot about the recent campaigns against what Donald Trump's disciples call DEI loyalty oaths That's diversity, equity, and inclusion. But really, the most accurate contemporary equivalent of the Cold War loyalty oath, the anti-communist loyalty oath, has been the anti-BDS oath, which is required of American university employees in as many as 38 states. And those are states that have basically outlawed boycotts of Israel either through legislation or executive order. These unconstitutional laws are fast being eroded or superseded, let's say, by the new executive orders against anti-Semitism codified in the IRA definition. But let me say that outside of the Middle East, anyone who speaks up for Palestinian rights very quickly learns that the primary front of confrontation is not with the Israeli state itself, but with our own states, with institutions that seek to exercise civil authority over us. The battles we've had to fight are with our own employers, our opinion makers, media gatekeepers, lawfare warriors, and the elected officials in our own backyard, very far from the IDF command centers in Tel Aviv and the killing fields of Gaza. We've learned how deeply invested these domestic structures of power and authority and their representatives are in the perpetuation of apartheid and genocide in the lands of historic Palestine. In the US, this investment far surpasses the actual dollar amount of bilateral trade and exchange with Israel, which is only the 27th largest trading partner of the US. Yet, if you look at these bilateral economic ties, they are very heavily concentrated in the defense and security sectors, where joint US-Israeli agreements on technology transfer, intelligence sharing, and future of warfare programs comprise a whole suite of firepower, not simply next generation missiles and drones, but also AI systems, cybersecurity networks, and quantum computing. The affinity of this military alignment, let's say, tightened after the attacks on 9/11, a day which you may recall that Netanyahu described as very good for Israel. After 9/11, American authorities turned directly to Israel's experience with homeland security and adopted many of its counterinsurgency and deterrence tactics. These have included extrajudicial executions by helicopter or by drone, carceral interrogation and torture techniques, biometric and audio surveillance, human profiling, and a host of policing methods devised during exchange programs between US and Israeli law enforcement. Needless to say, those tactics and technologies had all been promoted as having been battle tested against Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, arguably the most surveilled and controlled populations in the world today. In American cities, the application of these tactics to social control was first exposed to public scrutiny during the Ferguson uprising in 2014, which is largely a response to the Black Lives Matter movement. But how did they contribute to the rise of what I'm calling the Garrison University? There's been a lot written about the growth of managerialism in higher education, which has resulted in sort of vertical decision-making on the part of a high-salaried administrative class who behave like bosses with ownership rights over the institution. But when and why did these managerial tendencies, when did these managerial tendencies tip over into overt authoritarianism? Was it when anticipatory obedience to university policy on the part of professors and students was backed up by real threats of punitive or retaliatory discipline? Or was it when campus security officers were issued with military-grade firearms or ordered to assist police officers with even more advanced weaponry? Remember in 1970 when National Guardsmen were allowed on Kent State University campus and they shot anti-war student protesters. And then 11 days later, state highway patrolmen killed 2 students at Jackson State Universities. The response at the time was universally critical of the authorities. At Kent State, they had M1 rifles. And at Jackson State, they fired shotguns. Today, however, it's no longer necessary to bring in outside law enforcers who have regular issue firearms. Many American universities have their own, very heavily armed, police forces. In fact, let me just cite you one statistic. By 2014, at least 124 colleges had acquired military-grade equipment, including grenade launchers, armored vehicles, and M16 assault rifles. This was all a gratuity, more or less, from the Pentagon's 1033 program, which transfers military surplus to law enforcement agencies across the country. At the beginning of this last academic year, the regents of the University of California made headlines when they ordered new grades of weaponry, including drones, armed robots, pepper balls, projectile launchers, and sponge bullets. It's difficult to imagine the demilitarization of this kind of garrison university. After all, you may have noticed that once advanced securitization is introduced somewhere, it's seldom reduced. Desecuritization is not a very popular institutional tendency. And it's even less likely in American universities now that they have been targeted as havens for what the state is calling treasonable terrorists. Now, our liberal colleagues are at a loss to know what to make of these developments, especially since they've been put on notice by the Trump administration that their foundational faith in the First Amendment, in legal due process, in academic freedom, and in civil disobedience traditions can no longer be taken for granted. As for the left, we are not well prepared, quite frankly, to organize under authoritarianism, as many of our contemporaries have long had to do in other parts of the world. And perhaps this is because at some level, some of us still believe in the value of ideas and arguments that are open to debate in a liberal society. Now, the best lessons to learn about the future or the futility of that illusion come from the historical experience of Palestinians themselves, a people who have been stripped of every right under the sun, including in Gaza at this moment, the right to live. These rights have never been subject to the kind of debate that results in real recognition. They've always been assailed and torn apart by propaganda about the settlement claims of Zionism. And lately, the propaganda that for decades has helped to legitimize consent for Jewish supremacy in Palestine seems to have run out of steam. It no longer works. People are no longer fooled. Antonio Gramsci taught us that when that happens, when consent for hegemonic ideas fails, then elites turn to coercion. And there's nothing left but bullying, brute force, and barbarism, which is what we're seeing. This resort to unfettered aggression is all too evident now in the continuous wave of violence directed at Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, and Iran. And it is partially but ominously reflected in the US here in the permissions granted to armed police officers to rough up and detain peaceful pro-Palestinian protesters and basically abduct them off the streets. So maybe this battle over ideas is over. Maybe Zionism as an ideology has reached its impasse, as Nasser argued yesterday, quite persuasively. Maybe even among liberal Zionists who operate within the Jewish tradition of disputation and debate, and who have long agonized and wrung their hands over the occupation's impact on the soul of Israel. Although that's a big maybe. By contrast, and this is a point I want to really emphasize here, by contrast, the influence of religious belief, the realm of unshakable conviction and faith, has only grown in strength. Religious certitude is not just a natural element of ultra-nationalist settlers in the West Bank. It is also the mental fuel of Christian Zionists, for whom historic Palestine is an end times landscape of final reckoning, resurrection, conversion, and prophecies come true. In this regard, I think we cannot forget what makes Palestine liberation movement different from other decolonial efforts. And that is because we're talking about the Holy Land, where the three of the world's leading religious faiths have a central and vested interest, and where Jerusalem and other locations might figure quite prominently in the weekly worship rituals of billions of people all over the world. And in the popular mind, at least, which is different from the public mind where intellectuals seek to intervene, in the popular mind, the long colonial war against Palestine figures as predominantly and almost exclusively as a religious battlefield. Like the settlers, evangelical Christian Zionists operate beyond the realm of debate. And some of the more messianic ones who have, crusader tattoos on their chest are very well represented in the Trump administration. They feel their moment has come. Their appetite for engineering destruction, to cite the title of this conference, is not driven by the settler logistics of seizing land or by the ethnic cleansing of the people of Gaza. They are anticipating and hoping for a war to end all wars, the war of Gog and Magog, a bloody final battle at Armageddon, as described in the book of Ezekiel. And then Jesus will rule the world from the Temple Mount, and so on and so forth. For evangelists, then, Christian Zionist evangelists, war and catastrophic destruction are not a means to a colonial end with, collateral victims along the way. For them, the devastation is inevitable, willed by God, and therefore worthy of promotion and jubilation. And this doctrine is quite distinct from the just war theory, which was originally laid out by Augustine in the City of God, mirrored to some degree in the Muslim jihad doctrine of holy struggle. And just war is, I guess, typically referenced to support Israel's alleged right to defend itself. The evangelical doctrine is different. The annihilation of Gaza may have some significance for evangelical eschatology. It may have some significance as a kind of prelude, but Jerusalem is the ultimate stage of the end times drama. In Jerusalem, I remember overhearing an evangelist tour guide recant this narrative to his pilgrimage group. And especially the moment when he described in a very serene and hushed voice how God in this very place will usher in the apocalyptic violence of the last days, bring about the last judgment, and the sudden conversion of Jews, among other things. The flaming sword of God that he spoke about at that moment may be a far cry from the M16 rifles of the settlers and the vast arsenal, the vast aerial and terrestrial arsenal of the IDF. But for the time being, at least, they are on the same side of the Zionist imagination. Gaza does not have too much biblical significance. It is not the promised land of the West Bank, And so without a Jewish settler population, very few limits have been placed on its awful destruction. Since 2005, it's been called the world's largest open-air prison. Since October 2023, it's been called a concentration camp. Many referred to the Hamas attacks as a prison breakout. And the euphoria of people streaming like escapees towards their former homeland was palpable. The destruction of that open-air prison and the forced evacuation of its residents has finally stripped away, it seems, the very thin moral residue still clinging to Zionist doctrine. But the damage to the standing of the West has been just as serious. Gaza has not just been an open grave for so many Palestinians, it is also the burial ground of Western humanism. Since the genocide began, no one is willing to listen to lectures from the West, especially from Washington, about human rights, open speech, and civil reason. As for international law, it has not saved one life in Gaza. Now, of course, proclamations about the end of the West are nothing new, nor is the observation that the doctrine of human rights has only ever been very unevenly applied. Selective humanity is probably a much more accurate description. We can point to the statements, the many statements about the subhuman or animal character of Palestinians on the part of Israeli officials. But let's not forget the long history. Let's not forget the Balfour Declaration's failure to even name the native population of the lands between the river and the sea. And well before Gaza, American exponents of the war and terror activated the full lexicon of dehumanization in their paramilitary campaigns to reduce targeted Middle Eastern populations to the status of prey. Today, we see the Trump administration seems to be leading the world into an emerging order that has grown tired of human rights and its panoply of international conventions, which the US is very rapidly withdrawing from or ignoring for the most part in the same way as Israel has done for so many decades. But I want to conclude here on a more sustaining note. Nothing really truly mitigates the loss of life and land in Palestine over the last 20 months. But there is no denying that the tide of consciousness has turned. Hundreds of millions of people around the world have felt that shift, and they will have Palestine in their hearts and minds for the rest of their lives. And on American college campuses, at least, where the battle over these hearts and minds has been most intense, and where the cowardice and the petty bourgeois authoritarianism of college presidents has been most fully exposed, on our campuses, young people have learned what it means to earn solidarity. Our students and many of our faculty colleagues have learned the hard way that the Palestinian experience, especially that of prisoners, is not only a compass for Palestinian liberation, but also a compass for our own liberation and for a future that is not foreclosed by racial hatred and crushing debt and neo-colonial militarism and ecosystem collapse. And I think that is what is meant, among other things, by movement slogans like Palestine is everywhere or globalize the Intifada. And it's an education that will serve our students very well in the world beyond the academic institutions that have shown themselves to be so morally bankrupt in the face of scholasticide in Gaza, for example, Gaza's universities and schools and cultural heritage and libraries and museums being reduced to rubble. Not surprisingly, there are many skeptics around us who ask whether this knowledge, whether this solidarity matters, when it has made no difference, seemingly has made no difference to the slaughter rate in Gaza. And in response, we have to say, yes, of course it matters. Because when we practice hope against hope, each of us in the prisons that hold us hostage, and in whatever form it takes, we're doing what we can, what we're able to do to resist the erasure of a people, its land, and its history, which has been the single abiding goal of Zionism. And I want to end there in order to take questions or make space for comments that people might have. So thank you. Back to you, Basil.
Yes, thanks, Andrew. Andrew, you can hear me, right?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so thanks so much for this. I think you've given us a lot of things to think about, particularly the way you could describe the university today. One thing that stood in my mind is how we can think of this current moment, this ongoing genocide and its impact globally. In fact, on how it has structured perhaps institutions, not just across the United States, but globally. I think the way you started your intervention by, alluding to the space of the university itself becoming kind of a space of control and surveillance, and how that it has definitely a historic precedent, I think, not just in the US, but globally. But one thing I was thinking about is how we can overcome these kind of you know, various modes of oppression and violence that are seeping into our academic institutions, that are seeping into our daily life within and outside Palestine. So in a sense, these past 2 years, and if I may say even, the broader trajectory of settler colonialism in Palestine and beyond has continuously brought this kind of violence into our lives, into our institutions, into our kind of places that we hold close, and we think that these are the locations for thought, for critical thought, for overcoming the barriers that the settler colonial project itself had intended to kind of forcibly place upon us. So I think there's a lot of things to think about. I'll just, before asking questions myself, maybe we can see if there are any questions from the attendees. Whether you can type your questions in the Q&A button down at the Zoom, or if you'd like to speak, we could also raise your hand and we can have live questions.
Basil, I can perhaps in the meantime respond to what you just said, your
Yeah.
comment, if that's okay.
Yeah. Yes, of course.
Because I think they're very relevant, especially for a conference like this, largely composed of academics, who we tend to think of our campuses as havens for a certain kind of speech and a certain kind of truth. The universities are a site of truth. But the last 20 months or so, we've had to rethink this largely. The university is not a site of truth, it's a site of struggle. Our programs of critical study that many of us practice in, teach in, and study within, these programs came out of struggle. They weren't given to us, and we need to remember that. Birzeit University itself was born of struggle. We fought hard to get into the spaces that we inhabit, and that we managed to some extent in some disciplines exercise a lot of influence in. And like a lot of exponents of passion at work, I love my job, but I hate my employer. But over the last 20 months or so, what we've seen is the Palestinian cause in particular function as a kind of Trojan horse for the state repression of academic speech. Anti-Semitism, the specter, the largely fake specter of anti-Semitism has been a very cynical vehicle for the entry of government into what is largely a liberal cultural domain with a lot of left-wing precincts. But I just want to refer once again to one of the points I made in my comments, is that let's not forget that the universities have long been an arm of the warfare state, funded for that purpose, and the soft disciplines, which many of us work in, were a price to be paid. In some countries, especially in the US, the state is no longer willing to pay that price, and have decided that enough is enough. So that I wouldn't call that a silver lining, but it is something that's happened, an opportunity that's occurred over the last 20 months for us to, rethink our place within these institutions, even as we combat and have been on the front line of the worst waves of repression.
Yes. So there's a question here. Andrew, I'll read the question out loud. You probably can see it, but I'll read it also, just so that our translators can translate into Arabic. So there's a question. It says, "Thank you so much for giving this talk. It was quite revealing, not only in providing new information for me, but in shedding light on things that have been experienced day to day, but have been difficult to articulate. I myself am a student at NYU and have seen quite personally the failures in organizing on campus, especially between students and faculty. Do you have any specific recommendations for ways we can better organize, especially when it comes to creating connections between students and faculty, where there is sometimes a real or perceived power imbalance in their relationship?"
I think that's a very good question, Julian. I'm not sure that we've met, but I think what you're referring to is a challenge that has been encountered on a lot of U.S. college campuses over the last 20 months, where faculty and staff for Justice in Palestine chapters have sprung up, and now we have a national network with more than 130 chapters. These chapters were originally launched in order to support student movements on campus. And on many campuses, the relationships between students and faculty groups have been very tight, very productive, very meaningful. They have also generated some friction, in part because, as you point out, there is a real or perceived power imbalance in relationships. That's what happens within movements. There is internal friction within movements, and I think there's a lot I could say about this, but I don't want to get into too much detail. But I would say that at NYU, at least, our chapter, our faculty and staff for Justice in Palestine chapter, decided that we would, use a language of moving in parallel with the student movement. Not necessarily in lockstep because of the potential friction that you point out, but in parallel with supportive relationship. The decisions that we make within our faculty and staff groups are internal, and they're often shared with student groups, but not always. And it's a delicate, it's a fragile ecology, as with any movement grouping. But I think it's something that's widely understood at this point, and thank you for bringing up this point. It's very important at this point in time.
Okay, so there's a question from Iker. What do you think this next phase of campus struggle demands from us? And he says he's a comrade from Kuni.
That's a big question. I don't feel very comfortable being in a position to to articulate that, especially because I'm in the steering committee of the national network, and we function as a mutual aid network, which is to say we don't have centralized decision making on part of a steering committee. The steering committee tries to coordinate, but not make decisions. I think in light of some developments this summer, I would say there was a very important court trial that's been going on involving the AUP and the Middle Eastern Studies Association. It's the first real test of the Trump administration's willingness and capacity to do ideological deportation of students like Mahmoud Khalil. And we're waiting on the judge's verdict. We're quite optimistic, I would say cautiously optimistic at this point, that he will rule against the Trump administration. And that will be a huge win for the movement in general, and will establish that especially non-citizen students have the same speech protections under the First Amendment as citizens, and that they cannot be detained and deported for their protected speech. And I don't want to overemphasize the consequences of a decision like that, anticipating that it might go our way. But it's given us a lot of hope this summer that this would happen, and we'll see. Hopefully by the beginning of the academic year, we'll know the verdict, and we'll be able to build on that in a way that provides a layer of comfort, if not security, but a level of comfort to students who have been the most vulnerable in the movement, those who don't have citizenship in this country.
Thanks, Andrew. There's another question here. So it says that you said during your intervention that those on the left were not prepared to the idea that ideas and dialogue are no longer the best tool. What would be then an alternative to become prepared? So the alternative to ideas and dialogue, basically.
Well, I think one thing we, at least in the US, on the left, need to do at this point in time is listen more carefully to comrades in other parts of the world who have had to organize under authoritarianism, and for whom the public sphere, where ideas and dialogue are most valued, the public sphere has been completely eroded and eviscerated in certain contexts. We need to listen very hard to the experience of those, and especially to the experience of Palestinians. We also need to take a look at a closer look at American history. This assumption that we're living in a liberal society. Illiberal America has a very long and deep history. I recommend to you a book that was recently published by one of my colleagues, Steve Hahn, called Illiberal America, which goes into great detail about how liberalism, or the myth of liberalism, largely an invention of the post-war period in this country, at least, and that illiberalism has been the bedrock of American society since its inception. And there are lessons, of course, to be learned, as always, from that kind of history. But we can take a closer look at it.
Thanks, Andrew. There's another question here. So it says, since the Trump administration's crackdown on universities had an effect on the perceptions of faculty who have not been engaged in pro-Palestine activism. In other words, are there broad trends of compliance with the crackdown, or is the crackdown generating more support for activism that addresses the realities of genocide in Gaza?
Thank you, Lisa, for that question. I think on every I would say, just from my experience, in every campus there's a limited number of usual suspects who are active in their political speech, who do actually might take advantage of the security of academic freedom protections, but only a limited number. In the last 20 months or so, I do think we've seen that that small minority expand quite significantly. And a lot of people have come off the fence, just have not been able to stomach what they're seeing in Gaza and have raised their voices. But there, as you know, there are still many, many of our colleagues who are not doing so. And there's really very little risk involved if they are securely tenured, but sometimes it's the most securely tenured who are the least likely to speak up, even though they're the least vulnerable. But I do think we've seen a considerable expansion of that small core. I like to think that our national network of faculty and staff for justice in Palestine has helped. Also, the expansion of AUP chapters during this period, with the new, more activist slate at the helm of national AUP. In recent months, we've seen, I would say, a dwindling of activity. Generally, whether this is due to movement exhaustion, whether it's due to the repression or fear of deportation, it's difficult to say. Probably a combination of all three of these things. But again, there are analogies that we can draw with other movements. If you've been involved in movements, it's not an untypical experience for some of the enthusiasm to dwindle over time.
Thanks, Andrew. Let me see if there are other questions here. So, okay. So, and I have kind of I mean, just perhaps we have a few more minutes since we started a bit late, so 5 more minutes perhaps. But I just wonder, so you talked about in your talk, you talked about the possibility of demilitarizing universities, and even the descriptions you use and the history you refer to, and even the fact that across U.S. campuses, you do see this kind of warlike tactics, right? So the employment of drones, of assault rifles, of this kind of highly militarized reality across, I forget the number you referred to. I think it was 126 universities. But so I just wonder, does that mean, and it relates to one of the questions that was asked before, does that mean that it is impossible to kind of resist this kind of overt militarization? Because one thing I think about is, as you were speaking, I was imagining Israeli universities where, these universities, especially in this current moment, and of course there is definitely a historical trajectory of soldiers, carrying guns and weapons inside universities, but I just wonder how, can these universities be demilitarized here within the settler colonial project when they are definitely serving a central component of the settler colonial project? Because these universities are producing, soldiers, they are producing the engineers who are engineering these arms, these weapons, these technologies that are later used, and that are being used currently across the Gaza Strip. So in a way, I think your point about the possibility of demilitarization is very important. It made me, there's a strong parallel between what's taking place in the US, I think, and here across Israeli universities. This repression since the genocide began, the attack on Palestinian students and Palestinian academics inside Israeli institutions have exponentially increased. It's very far-fetched to think about a political movement or political mobilization inside these universities, because those students know that if they dare to organize or to speak, they would be arrested and maybe even more. So I think there is this global trend that's taking place, this global trend towards militarization, and perhaps Israel and the US are definitely leading this, this overt militarization. But, and this is my question, I'm sorry for the long comment, but, um, and you alluded to this slightly, but have academic institutions ever been demilitarized in a way, or have they, can we think about can we think about a moment when an academic institution was actually serving a different purpose? Not aligning, your talk was about the prison also, right? You combined both the prison and the academic institution. So I just wonder, is it possible to escape from that prison of the academic institution or not, given this moment and what we have been witnessing across, Palestine and other parts of the world? So just,
Yeah, I can't think of it. I mean, in direct response to your question, Basil, I can't think of a good example, although I'm not an expert on this topic in particular. I would say it seems unlikely to me, however. But in terms of how, I mean, the larger context for this is the development of the U.S. and Israel as warrior states par excellence, in a sense. The U.S. Because of the vast expenditure on its military, and the role of the U.S. Army within American history and currently all over the world, and in Israel, where the line between soldiers and civilians is very thin indeed, since most civilians have served in the IDF. And the thing I would add to this, and again, I just want to reemphasize a central component of my talk was about the religious component of this, the militant Christian Zionism. Because we tend to, as intellectuals, we tend to be very secular. We have a very secular view of geopolitics and imperialism in general, and we see Zionist settler expansionism simply as an expression of materialism or resistance to decolonization, as Nasser explicated yesterday. And I agree with him, but I would add the religious dimension here, because this is an issue not just of popular culture, but of elites too. In the popular mind, the Middle East is a religious battleground, not at all different in many ways from the Crusades. And for the governing elites, of course, they've long been driven by Christian Zionism. Think about the Balfour Declaration and the theology behind the Mandate administration. And again, I'm not an expert on religious history or theology, but as an Americanist, I know how much U.S. exceptionalism, the sense that the U.S. is exempt from the historical patterns of development that govern other states, how much of that is rooted in theology, in visions of a New Jerusalem, or visions of providence. Israel is the other country that claims a similar state of exception from the outset, and is much more deeply rooted in scripture and biblical myth eventually. But with the same kind of privilege, that we don't conform to state formation elsewhere. We're not answerable to legal sanctions governing the conduct of other states. Trump and Netanyahu may be very extreme manifestations of this claim to be exempt from all international norms, but the sense of entitlement is very long-standing. And that is why I think it's among other things, when we speak about the Palestine exception, this notion among liberals in particular that all speech is okay and acceptable except pro-Palestinian speech. In most cases, we're really talking about the Israeli exception, the Israel exception. Most of the time, that speech involves criticisms of Israel because Israel singles itself out for exemptions and exceptions. It demands special treatment again and again. I can't remember which Israeli statesman said this, but I think it was largely true. He said, we succeeded in turning the Jewish question into the Palestinian question, meaning the Jews were no longer a problem in the world's eyes. Palestinians were now the problem. And so for that and other reasons, I think it's time to reframe to reframe the Palestine exception whenever we use that and start to call it the Israeli exception, because that makes Israel the problem, which it should be in front and center. And I think maybe I'll end on that note.
Thanks, Andrew. I'll just see if there's another question. Sorry if the translation was, someone asked about the translation in Arabic, but there might have been a slight internet delay. So are there any other questions for Professor Andrew before we end? We'll have like a slight break, maybe a 10-minute, 15-minute break. We have a next session at 6:45, but we can begin at 6:50 so that people can take, well, 6:40, yeah, 6:50. So you can take 10-minute break, and we'll just ensure the translation is working well. But any last questions for Professor Andrew? Okay. Thank you for this. We look forward to having you at Berzait hopefully soon. And thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you. Shukran.
Thanks, Andrew. Okay, and for everyone, we will return at 6:50. So in 10 minutes, we'll just take a slight break.
Hey, Basil, I don't know if you can hear me, but I just emailed you and the organizers Tabinda's a PowerPoint presentation. And hi, people on my panel, Sohaj, Romana, Iman, and Pablo.
Hi, Lisa.
I just Tabinda just sent me the PowerPoint, so I just forwarded it to you and the organizers.
Yeah, so I think the people uh, who are sharing PowerPoints can actually do the share screen from your side.
Okay. Yeah, it looks like there's a
Who's the
share
other link?
screen.
Who's
She's
the other
not
link?
on. Pardon
I'm
me?
here. Oh, why does my name says Lisa?
Okay.
Let me
Yeah, I was
check.
wondering.
I
I
think
thought you were
I joined from the link you sent me. That's
Oh,
why.
okay. Sorry. Yeah, she joined from
Oh,
the link they sent you. I
Uh-huh.
wasn't sure if they sent you the same link.
okay, but I
Yeah,
just
you
want
can.
to, Pablo, Pablo, ¿estás aquí?
Sí, estoy en línea.
Ok, Pablo, te quería preguntar, tú vas a presentar en español, ¿cierto?
Sí, en español voy a presentar.
Perfecto. And Tabinda, can you, you said you could present in English, right?
May I please present in English? Yes.
Yeah.
Please.
So just because, Lisa, I think I will translate Pablo's intervention because the Spanish translator has not shown up yet.
Okay.
So I'll just, yeah, so I think just for the,
Well, my Spanish is better than my Arabic, so I kind of got a general sense of the paper.
uh, I'll,
Whereas Jumana, sorry, I had to have my friend tell me what the sort of the thrust of your paper.
let's see. Okay. Um,
And Basil, Iman is in Lebanon, so she was reminding me of the possibility of
ah,
losing electricity or something. So yeah, if you do lose electricity, we'll just join back whenever you can.
of course, we had the same issue now. I mean, we we had to shut down some computers because it was not connecting well. Okay, so I'll, one
I
second.
just want to test my microphone. Can you all hear me? Okay.
Excellent. Perfect.
Yes.
Okay. Okay,
Yeah,
awesome.
no, it's perfect. And what I'm going to do for people on my panel is, I'm just going to introduce the panel. Then I'm going to introduce each of you, like do a little bio right before your talk, rather than doing all of them at once. So, and we're going to speak in the order in which it appears in the program. So it's Tabinda first, Iman second, Soha third, Jomana fourth, and Pablo fifth. Yeah, and I will, sort of interrupt if you're getting way past the 12-minute mark. Just because there's so many of us and we want to have time for Q&A. But I think these papers hang together really nicely. I mean, it's a very, it's a very coherent and cohesive panel.
Was there a session just before this one, like a private session or something?
No, it was the keynote by Andrew Ross.
Oh,
So you can
I
you
don't
can
know
only
what.
you can only like except for the panel that you're on, you have to go in through the main Zoom link for the audience.
It's so weird. I somehow missed this in the program. That I thought, I literally thought that we had
Oh, looks like she's freezing.
nothing from like the last panel at like one. Okay, well, that's good
No, it
to
was
know.
Andrew gave actually Bessel's great keynote. And Basil, is it set up so that when whoever is speaking, then their face takes over the screen and everybody else disappears?
Were you asking me a question? Sorry.
Yeah, I was just saying that is it set up so that when whoever's speaking, only their face appears and then the other
Yes.
Okay,
Yes,
perfect.
let's try. Actually, Tabinda, can you try?
Yes, I can test. Okay, so I have my presentation, and then if I make it large,
This is perfect.
show, you can see it?
Yes.
Yes.
So I think it'll show all of us, like for me, it's showing a panel, like on the right.
Yeah, up along the top. I think, yeah, I guess you have to sort of do, if you want to do speaker, well, maybe it's not set up anyway, but I think it's fine. Like, I don't know what the audience sees, but like I see everybody's head along the top at your PowerPoint.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
once this is recorded, it'll be put on YouTube. It just like in case we're not as polished as we'd like to be in our delivery, is it going to be immemorialized forever?
Don't worry. YouTube has a lot of tolerance for presentation imperfections.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Wait, I'm getting
You
this.
can stop sharing your screen until we're ready for your
stop. Okay, great.
Yeah, and we just confirmed that people saw your screen, Tabinda, and they saw you when you're speaking. So this is all good. Okay, just give me 2 minutes. We're just trying to figure out the Spanish translation, just to make sure it's all good, and we'll begin. Just 2 minutes. How are you, Lisa?
Okay, well, welcome back to the second day of Engineering Destruction, the conference. And I am very grateful to be part of this. And I want to give thanks to Basil Faraj and all the folks at Birzeit and all of the other sponsoring organizations. So my name is Lisa Hajar. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And this panel is titled Violence in Transit, How Repressive Technologies Cross Borders. So we have 5 presenters today. And what I'm going to do is introduce each presenter before they start. And then they'll have about approximately 12 or so minutes to present. So without further ado, our first presenter is Tabinda Mahfouz Khan, who is a professor and investigator with El Centro de Estudios de Asia y África at El Colegio de México. Her research focuses on Sharia and the state, the human rights of women and Islam, democracy and authoritarianism, social movements, politics, and culture in contemporary South Asia. And her paper is titled Making Muslim Monsters: How War on Terror Discourse Facilitated Genocide in Gaza and Why It Must Be Retired from Political Science. So Tabinda, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lisa. Just to share, my name is Tabinda. It's a Persian name. It comes from Tab, which means light, and in that, so Tabinda. I'm going to share. Here we go. So basically, I just want to share a little bit about my perspective because I'm originally from Pakistan and I did a PhD in political science from Columbia University. So I both studied in the discipline of American political science, but I also view it as an outsider to that discipline. As a citizen of Pakistan and now an academic in Mexico City at El Colegio de México. So I view it largely as a construct, this discipline, and its concepts and theories also as constructs that are influenced by the particular power structure in which it's embedded. Also, I'm an outsider to the Middle East. I'm not Palestinian and I'm not Arab. So I take a partly outsider's lens. I look at how this phenomena has a global impact, that currently during this genocide, the primary victims are Palestinians. But the process that got us to the point where the world can tolerate a genocide that's being broadcast live on our screens for 2 years is sort of a much longer process that spans at least the last 40 years. And it entails not just Palestine, but also the broader Middle East and also the world, in which this discourse of terrorism has been used to demonize movements that are anti-colonial and anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist. So that's what I'll be discussing. Okay. So according to Al Jazeera, as of yesterday, the current casualty count, according to the Ministry of Health in Gaza, is over 60,000 people. And I think that count doesn't include the number of people who are missing, who could be under the rubble. So the actual count is probably much higher than this. And while the destruction that has been ongoing in this war, it's been classified as a genocide by the leading genocide scholars of the world, right? But I would argue that we should count these casualties in a much higher casualty count of the war on terror, which the number of deaths from that is nearly 1 million people, according to the Cost of War project of the Watson Institute at Brown University. And these post-9/11 wars that were justified through the discourse of terrorism were conducted in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. So as an academic and as a Pakistani, when I hear the word terrorism, it resonates very deeply because I've personally witnessed how it's been abused since 9/11 by states. And so this Great War on Terror was actually the second war on terror. And there was an earlier first war on terror, which was declared by President Reagan and Secretary of State Shultz after the suicide bombing in Beirut that killed 245 US military personnel. That was in 1983, right? So Netanyahu wrote this book, Terrorism, How the West Can Win. And basically, the Netanyahu family, they set up the Jonathan Institute in 1979 to educate the public on the dangers of terrorism. Its first conference was held in 1979. It was attended by George H.W. Bush. Another conference was held in 1984 in Washington, D.C. And basically in this book, and Netanyahu's book, it's based on the talks that were given at that conference. So if you study this book, it has contributions by George Shultz himself, the Secretary of State of the United States. It has contributions from Orientalist scholars of Islam, who now connect this phenomena of terrorism to Islam and Islam's relationship with the West. And so this clash of civilizations, theory by Samuel Huntington that we heard, preceding 9/11 and after the war, during the war on terror, it has a much kind of older genesis. In this book by Netanyahu, you can see the contours very clearly of this kind of discourse developing where these kind of prejudices towards Islam are combined with this idea of terrorism, right? So George W. Bush, his doctrine of preemptive war against state sponsors of terrorism, NSS 2002, it was actually preceded by Shultz's doctrine, NSDD 138, which wasn't public until 2010. And this doctrine was developed after discussions between Shultz and Netanyahu. Netanyahu was then, in the 1980s, he was the political attaché at the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. And so there was an alliance that developed between American neoconservatives, Israeli hawks, and Orientalist scholars of Islam that dates back to at least the 1980s, right? So I would argue that the discourse of the war on terror, it's a dehumanizing ideology that is actually enabled by the discipline of political science. My entry point into it, or my concern, is as an academic. So I first wrote this paper when in our university we had a conference on genocide in Palestine 2 years ago. And then I attended another conference at Columbia in October of last year, which was asked the question, what can universities do about genocide? And my argument was one thing universities can do is for academics to stop using this discourse on terrorism that enables genocide, because it is an example of a dehumanizing ideology. So if we study dehumanization, there's a lot of literature on it. David Smith has a book called Making Monsters, The Uncanny Power of Dehumanization. So basically, what he says is that this phenomena has existed throughout human history for thousands of years. This tendency to see others as less than human, people who then become morally permissible or obligatory to kill. It's based on racialization and hierarchical thinking. And he says that human beings, they have an innate instinct to see other member of their species as human, But they can suspend this instinct, deferring to the epistemic authority of cultural experts who spread dehumanizing ideologies. So as an academic, for me, it is very important to ask that are we being these cultural experts who are using our epistemic authority for the sake of humanization or dehumanization, right? So the way I see these two concepts as linked is that the core process of monster construction is the projection of fear onto a group that is marked as other or different. And political scientists who study the concept of terrorism in their literature, they pretty much accept that this is a nebulous term which has very unclear boundaries, right? If they accept that, so the problem with that, if a concept has unclear boundaries, is that it can easily be stretched from one group or actor or event to another one, right? Because it's not clear what is terrorism and what is not terrorism. They also accept that it's a subjective judgment that reflects the interests of those making it, right? So they accept that, there's terrorism by the state and also by non-state actors. But while academics can accept that there is state terrorism and add nuances to this fact, ultimately the people who control the armies and who influence the media, the states there's a power asymmetry, right? So if we create this concept, if we give it legitimacy, if we put it out into the world, academics do not have as much influence over the actual, politics in the world or strategic, So they're actually enabling a process that they can
هذه
control.
عملية تمكينية.
Okay, sorry, I can continue. Okay, so basically, because it's a subjective judgment that reflects interest.
Sorry, Tavenda, I'm the interpreter. I have been removed from interpretation. That's why you hear me. Dr. Bassel,
Okay.
if you can assign me as interpreter again, please.
I'm just pausing there, Lisa, at 8 minutes and 30 seconds. So I'm keeping an eye. I'm going to quickly wrap up, okay? Because I know I'm going to be eating into other people's time if I go over.
Tavenda, go ahead.
You can
on.
continue.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. And the third is that emotion is core to the definition of what is terrorism. And this creates a role for political entrepreneurs who can interpret the degree of public threat, and they can basically manipulate public fear, right? So this enables executive overreach and an abuse of power. So Lakoff says that because extreme fear can be provoked at any time, war on terror means war without end, right? So after the October 7th attack, we saw this kind of atrocity propaganda that I feel enabled the current genocide. And President Erdogan, he's called Hamas a resistance movement, and John Mearsheimer, an IR theorist, he was asked in an interview on 27th October 2023 if he agreed with this assessment that Hamas was a resistance movement. So he said he did. It is a resistance movement that sometimes uses terrorist tactics. So when John Mearsheimer uses the word terrorism, he qualifies it and adds nuances to it, right? He doesn't call the entire movement as terrorist and then all the civilians are. But I would say that even though academics can add the nuance, they are not actually influential in the mainstream media. Nobody invites John Mearsheimer for an interview on, the mainstream broadcast channels. It's mostly through YouTube that we hear his opinions. So basically, this kind of nuance that academics add to what is terrorism, it was lost in this countervailing atrocity propaganda. So basically, all the violence on October 7th was blamed on Hamas, and then by extension on all the civilians in Gaza. We know that from subsequent research that violence, there were multiple actors involved, There were the Qassam brigades, there were other militant groups, there were civilians, there was also the IDF. So a lot of the destruction that we saw, the charred bodies, were due to IDF, retaliation. And that was sort of blamed, and by extension on all civilians. And so in November 2023, we saw this kind of atrocity propaganda, but it was being circulated by the people in the highest levels of power in the political and cultural elite of the United States. So President Biden repeated the beheaded babies propaganda. Later on, the White House the spokesman, they clarified that Biden hadn't actually seen photos of these beheaded babies, but he had put that fact out there, right? That statement out there, and he never really retracted it. And similarly, there was this idea of a Hamas rape machine that was repeated by Sheryl Sandberg and also by Hillary Clinton. All of this sort of facilitated the Western public's kind of willingness to tolerate or look the other way, I would argue. There's a Twitter user, Rim Khadraoui, who argues that Palestinians are always killed twice, by the Israeli army and by the Western media. Okay, so Lisa, I'm at 11:49. I think I need at least 3 minutes, so I'm sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, so basically Walt and Mearsheimer, they have a book and also an article called The Israel Lobby. And so they basically say that there is this loose coalition that controls the policy of the United States on Israel, right? They say that this policy is not in the strategic interests of the United States. John Mearsheimer argues that it's also not in the strategic interests of Israel because it is overreaching, and it doesn't have an end goal. And so basically this loose coalition, it consists of AIPAC, these conference of presidents of major Jewish organizations, Christian evangelicals, neocon policymakers, columnists, and diplomats, and as well as sort of DC think tanks also take a pro-Israeli line. And Mearsheimer, in their book, they talk about how Brookings, it used to be more independent, but now it's Middle East policies formulated in an institute that's funded by an Israeli-American businessman and Zionist, Chaim Siban. So basically, since the 1990s, this lobby has argued in the United States that US and Israel share this common threat of terrorism. But under this rubric of terrorism, they compress Palestinians, what they call rogue states, such as Syria and Iran, basically strategic rivals of Israel, and militant groups in Arab and the broader Arab and Muslim world. So since September 2001, this Israel lobby was very pivotal in advocating for the war in Iraq. Immediately after September 11th, Wolfowitz advised Bush to start, attack Iraq. And the Pentagon group that was responsible for investigating links between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein, it was filled with neocons and recruits from pro-Israel think tanks. And they reported to Douglas Feith, who had close ties to Likud. So basically in this book, they trace very carefully, using inside knowledge of Washington, D.C., how the key policymakers in charge of Middle East policy in Washington, D.C. had very close ties to Likud. So basically there were Israeli hawks, I guess you would say, who are now controlling this. So there was pressure from them to attack Syria and Iran after 9/11. And Congress passed a bill threatening sanctions against Syria if it didn't stop supporting terrorism. And this was endorsed by AIPAC. So in this particular instant, the president of the United States did not want war with Syria at this point because the Syrian regime was cooperating in their struggle against Al-Qaeda. But AIPAC is able to override the authority of the president due to its pressure on Congress, right? Okay. So basically in this book, Netanyahu located the source of terrorism in two movements: communist totalitarianism and Islamic and Arab radicalism. So he says basically it's Marxists and Muslim radicals. But then his section on Islam kind of obscures the material basis of Islamist opposition and tries to present it as this long-standing civilizational struggle, right? So he says that Arab radicals, they hate the West, not because of Israel or because of what Israel does, but because Israel is an organic part of the West. And they've always hated the West, and that's why they hate Israel. And so basically this idea of terrorism, it's like a multi-use concept. It has been used by Israel to demonize anti-colonial resistance in Palestine, to justify wars against strategic rivals of Israel. And I would argue that it's also a much broader phenomena because it filters down from the US power system throughout the world. So it's used by US allies and satellite states to demonize their own anti-colonial, anti-capitalist movements. So for example, the Indian government after 9/11, they called the Kashmiri resistance terrorists, right? And I would say it also includes Muslim states. So although my title is Making Muslim Monsters, I don't think it is restricted just to Muslims because there are divisions within Muslim states, right? And Muslims use it against Muslims. So for example, the Pakistani government has used it against the Baloch resistance, It has used it against critics of the military. It's very it can be expanded. So these basically they also after 9/11 they passed a number of anti-terrorism laws, and they use these laws against critics of the military. Anybody who's resisting, environmental destruction, basically all resistance groups are now put under the cover of these anti-terrorism laws. And there's a regime of disappearances that are justified through anti-terrorism campaigns. So Islam, the racialization of Muslims, it makes it a very potent discursive frame, right, in their particular context. But it is a much broader global phenomena that encompasses a struggle against imperialism, colonialism, and capitalist exploitation. So the struggle of Palestinians is the struggle of actually every person on this earth, who wants to live a dignified life. And for that reason, I would say they have common cause with it. And using this term terrorism, it enables a state of abuse of power, imperialism, and colonialism. So that's why I would argue it should be retired from political science. And I have gone 5 minutes over. I'm very sorry.
Thank you so much, Tabinda. Our next speaker is Iman Ali, who is a PhD student in anthropology at Cornell University. She's in Lebanon now. Her doctoral research focuses on South Lebanon and addresses issues of colonialism, militarism, war, and state making. And the paper she's presenting today is titled Calculated Cruelty, Israel's Use of Technology in Lebanon. Iman, the floor is yours.
Okay, let me just take a second to load up the presentation. If it won't work, let's just see. Can you all see a gray screen?
Not yet. We saw it for a moment and then it kind of went away.
Okay, if it doesn't cooperate, then I'll just stay without it. That's fine. Okay, that's okay. I'll just have to do it without the screen. So it'll be just me. Okay, so thank you all to everybody who has helped make this conference possible. Like Lisa said, my name is Iman Ali, and this paper, which I've titled Calculated Cruelty, Israel's Use of Technology in Lebanon, is part of my larger dissertation research. And for context, my larger project centers the experiences of Shia Lebanese in South Lebanon as bearers of Israel's occupation and invasions, as those who have bear the heaviest burden of Israel's occupations and invasions since 1948, making them subjects of empire through Israel's violence and second-class citizens of Lebanon, but that was already in place before Israel. And so for this paper, I focused on Israel's use of technology in Lebanon to understand how the technology has transformed the lived experiences of war and how it has exceeded the temporality of war itself. So challenging our understanding of war and creating a new reality in which war lingers and occupation returns. And so for context, my research in Lebanon began in 2021, and my ethnographic fieldwork began last summer in 2024, just as the situation was escalating. And so this paper examines Israel's use of technology, specifically its military operations, beginning of October 2023 in the aftermath of the Al-Aqsa uprising. And I focus on how such advanced tactics have transformed Israel's violence into what I call calculated cruelty, the ability to kill whenever and wherever, technologizing the process of death itself. Since 2023, Israel has expanded its use of UAV surveillance drones, killer drones, and low-flying warplanes targeting specific areas and populations, embedding terror into daily life. And so this paper challenges the characterization of Israel's actions in Lebanon as simply warlike. I'll just stop right there. Okay, we're good.
Go ahead.
Instead, I argue that its technological warfare signifies a shift beyond overkill toward a mode of violence that renders anyone, anywhere perpetually killable. And so this paper asks, what does it mean to live under a system that surveils, selects, and eliminates in real time? And how has technology expanded Israel's monopoly on violence, enabling it to designate and execute threats at will? And so in order to address these questions, I focused on the pager attacks, the evacuation maps, and Israel's daily tactics of remaining present in South Lebanon in the aftermath of the war. So the paper is divided into 3 sections, respectively, which I have titled To Maim, To Terrorize, and To Control. And I embed my analysis within men-based theorization of necropolitics, Jasper Pawar's Right to Maim, and the broader discourse on the war on terror. And so I have this on the slide, but unfortunately I can't show you. In an interview with a former detainee in South Lebanon, he is told by an Israeli member who was torturing him, this is during the occupation, that they don't aim to kill them all at once. Instead, they aim to kill them one member at a time. رح نقتلكم عضو عضو ونخليكم تتمنوا الموت 100 مرة. And so in Arabic, he uses the word عضو, which means member, but it also means body part. And in the aftermath of the pager attacks, I can't help but continue to think about this quote. And this is precisely what I argue is what Israel has done through the pager attacks. It was not meant to kill Hezbollah members who were fighting directly on the front lines. No, the aim instead was to maim, to forever mark anyone who was remotely affiliated with Hezbollah. What this did is that it marked the Shias as killable, as maimable, as targets of violence that are always ready to explode. And just to know, I can't delve into the generalization nor the conflation between Shias as all becoming Hezbollah members just for the sake of time, but I just aim to explore the ways in which Israel's colonial violence has shifted against Shias in Lebanon so that they all become conflated with resistance with Hezbollah. So in these pager attacks, what they did on the ground, having experienced them, what happened in Beirut, is that they solidified that the Shias are not just easily killable and maimable, but that their own technology was not to be trusted. It also began the culture of fear that would be associated with being in the proximity of Shias. Here, the Shias of Lebanon, at least those that were visibly Shia, would become what Samar al-Baluchi calls citizen suspects. And so this fear became more widely spread in Lebanon in the days leading up to war, as the hundreds of thousands of people of Shias had fled the southern part of the country, fleeing the war. And now they were unable to find housing because many people did not want to house Shias, not because they believe that Shias are unworthy of safe housing, but it was because your technology can be blown up at any point. Why should I house you and in retrospect or in context lose my own life or my own housing? And so I link this to Israel's approach of maiming non-armed Palestinians, where it targets Palestinians at the joints, specifically at the knees, maiming them and forever debilitating them. This is as means, as Pawar argues, to lower the fatality rates in Palestine. And here, what these pager attacks did is that it forever mutilated and marked young men, thousands of young men who have had their whole life ahead of them. And so I'll just leave it there. I will say now, in the context of the pager attacks, the sniper is no longer standing there ready to shoot you. The sniper is now in your pocket or readily attached to your hip. And so now I'll move on to the second part, which is to terrorize. And this is what I talk about through the evacuation orders. Between October and November 2024, Israel introduced a chilling psychological weapon, publicly releasing maps of buildings it planned to attack. For the first time, Lebanese civilians watched helplessly as their homes were marked for destruction. The anticipation of destruction, coupled with their inability to intervene, introduced a new dimension of psychological warfare. And this, again, I'm reminded of in the West Bank of IDF soldiers knocking on the roof, conducting roof knocks in houses seconds before blowing them up. And so what these evacuation maps did is that it delegated the act of terrorizing, the act of, again, like you as a Lebanese civilian, you're not able to do anything and you're just watching your house get blown up and you just have to sit there. And now Israel has conventionally done so through the evacuation maps, as we have seen them do in Gaza, and as they continue to do so in Beirut and other parts of Lebanon. But really, they've used this tactic specifically in Dahiya, the Shia majority suburb of Beirut. And it's worthy to know Israel's language in the evacuation maps. It's always the same. You are in the vicinity of a building that Hezbollah's terrorist group is using to store weapons. For the sake of your safety and for the safety of your children and families, you're required to evacuate this building and move as far away as 500 meters. And so it's really interesting because here, it is Hezbollah who has endangered the civilians and not Israel itself for the attack. It is Hezbollah who appears to be using civilians as human shields, and Israel is simply doing what is preventative and necessary. So Israel is saying, look, we are benevolent. We're conducting an act of seeming benevolence, of even letting you flee after you've been being used as a human shield, perhaps without your own knowledge. And we're going to assume that you had nothing to do with it, but we're going to let you flee. And so I just very briefly, in the most recent attack that happened on June 5, the day of Arafah, on Eid al-Adha, these evacuation maps turned what would be a holy night of prayer and celebration into one of absolute terror. At that night when Israel issued a few evacuation maps and had targeted, I believe, 8 buildings at that point. Thousands fled their homes in a frenzy as the already congested roads of Dahye became even more crowded. Many were stuck in their homes and had to wait in terror for the strikes to begin, in anticipation that caused physical and psychological harm onto those who were experiencing it. When Eid arrived a few hours later, life seemed to resume somewhat pathologically in Dahye, another testament to the will of the Shias to continue to stay and endure. And so I will just say that this is the first in its 76 years of attacking Lebanon. This is the first time in which Israel is publicly sharing en masse the infrastructural targets of its plans, and again performs an act of cruel benevolence of letting civilians flee seconds before destroying their home. And this is an act that the US had actually also done in Iraq in their attacks against electric infrastructure as a means to turn the civilian population against Saddam Hussein, fully knowing the psychological and physical harm that this was conducting on civilian populations. And the idea was that this was a necessary act of violence that needs to be done. And what I'm trying to argue here is that Israel continues to take its play from the pages of US foreign policy in Iraq and in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And so lastly, I talk about the how Israel continues to linger in the aftermath of the war, and what I call the last subsection, which is to control. So even after the war, life under Israel's terror tactics continues. Drones hover constantly, not only gathering intelligence, but also broadcasting messages of humiliation and defeat. This persistent technological presence extends beyond conventional warfare, shaping a system where violence is no longer just about overwhelming control, but about maintaining total control. So, for example, in a coffee shop in a border village, a drone enters and comments on the drinks that a few of the men are having. Oh, عم تشربوا نسكافيه? In another border town, pamphlets are dropped on civilians and Israel actually went ahead and printed Hezbollah money. And I wish I could show you all the pictures, but they printed Hezbollah money and they dropped this in pamphlets en masse onto border villages, warning civilians to stay away from engaging in any acts that would give them any money that is so-called like tainted Hezbollah money. In other border villages, as it does almost every single day, Israel enters and continues to destruct roads and blow up newly renovated homes. And in the country at large, the drones remain. And Israel continues to call civilians even without any threats to bomb their homes. So actually this happened for many weeks after the war. My family would be sitting around just minding their own business, and then they would get a call from Israel for no reason. This is just, again, to remind them, hey, we are here. We know you, we know who you are, we know where you live, and we have your phone number. And for my aunt, for example, she got calls every single day at 6 a.m. This was sort of her unwelcomed, unconventional morning alarm. In her forthcoming book on resurgency in Iraq, Kelly Rubai notes similarly. In Rubai's analysis on U.S. language during the invasions, the Americans are forced to kill Iraqis should they present themselves as anything but should they present themselves as anything other than exhibiting sheep-like docility, which Rubai argues becomes a precondition for livability under regimes of coercive peace. Simply put, the Americans seek no harm to Iraqi citizens as long as Iraqi civilians stand by while the US invades. In Lebanon, Israel continues to do the same. And in conclusion, the barbarian author, the terrorist, could be eliminated in a drone strike without hesitation, easily and cleanly in the middle of a night in a calculated and precise act of cruelty. As David Gregory, the war on terror blurs the geographic line between Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and Palestine, and now we can also add in Lebanon. One of the aims of writing this chapter is to challenge the characterization of violence enacted by states, Dare we even say that Israel's use of violence constitutes that of state terrorism? Perhaps that is a question no longer worth answering, for in the end, on the ground, Israel's use of technology that aims, terrorizes, and controls points to something that is much more sinister and perhaps surpasses our own understanding of terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can't wait to read your dissertation. Our next speaker is Soha Sakhazadeh, who is an Iranian PhD student in the Department of Film and Media Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And Soha is also a member of the Researchers Against War Collective. Their dissertation examines how satellite and drone technologies participate in wartime perception of Iran and the competing politics that arise from the material circulation of such technologies. The paper Soha is presenting today is titled Drone Recirculation, Iran's Reverse Engineering Warfare. Soha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lisa. Just a second, making sure that I can share my screen. Okay, you all see my screen and hear my voice?
Yes.
All right, great. And let me start the clock. Right. First, I would like to express my gratitude to all the organizers. It's an honor and a privilege to hear all the panelists and to learn from you all, and also special thanks to the translators. At the 2018 Munich Security Conference, Benjamin Netanyahu brandished a metal piece during his address, claiming it as a fragment of an intruding Iranian drone recently downed by the Israeli Air Force, accusing Iran of an unprovoked aggression. Shooting it over the city of Bisan on February 10th, the IAF then struck the drone's alleged command trailer in Syria operated by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. In the process, however, one of the fighter jets succumbed to a Syrian missile, prompting Israel's intensive retaliation across Syria against air defense sites and Iranian facilities, killing 25 people. In its aftermath, the IAF boasted the second wave.
Yes? So just slow down a little bit just for the translators.
Oh,
just
sorry.
A little bit. Okay. Yeah.
In its aftermath, the IAF boasted the second wave assault as the largest attack against Syrian air defenses since 1982, the second Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And Israeli media called the event the first direct military confrontation between Iran and Israel. Yet two precedents were left out of media coverage and Netanyahu's tactical speech. Disclosed a month later, 10 days before the downing of the Iranian drone, Mossad had infiltrated a secret archive in Tehran, stealing documents pertaining to Iran's alleged nuclear weaponization research program discontinued in 2003. The Iranian drone itself, according to the Israeli military, was a reverse-engineered model of a stealth reconnaissance drone down in Iran in 2011, the American RQ-170 Sentinel. In the past 2 decades, scholars in the global north have extensively studied drone technology and warfare. Yet, the Israeli exception aside, the Middle East appears in this literature primarily as the militarized, non-technical target. This body of work, particularly those produced in North America, has understandably stayed with the United States drone operations in quote-unquote war on terror. In doing so, however, these works tend to inadvertently adopt the drone's top-to-bottom remote view, seeing the people on the ground primarily as racialized target that, borrowing from Mohammed al-Khor's words, serves as perfect victims for academic research. However, to understand drone technology and warfare in the region, we must let go of the United States and Israeli perspectives, as for those on the ground, the drone is neither a distant phenomenon nor living under its warfare reducible to being targeted. Amplifying the voices of Palestinians, Yemenis, and Pakistanis, Atef Abu Saif and Nasser Hossain echoed the intimate, relentless, terrorizing sound that aircraft make, Similarly, Lisa Hajar elevates the legal efforts by Palestinian and Pakistani human rights organizations in holding Israeli and American officials accountable. Indebted to these works, I contend that we must also recognize the technological agency of people in the Middle East in both responding to the US and Israeli drones, as well as engineering and enacting their own drone warfare. Faced with aerial invasions and economic sanctions in the name of its nuclear program, since early 2000s, seizing and reverse engineering American and Israeli aircraft has systematically informed Iran's growing drone industry and warfare across the Middle East and beyond. In this paper, I employed the American Sentinel and its Iranian adaptations as a case study to examine Iran's re-engineering practices that call for interrogating the drone inside out, tracing the material recirculation of its warfare on the ground. This case study, I argue, challenges the drone's assumed technological invulnerability and the non-reciprocity of its remote warfare, inviting us to examine not just drone operations, but its engineering and the global supply chain of parts that materialize its warfare. On December 4, 2011, Iranian state news agencies reported that Iran's electronic and air defense forces had downed a US Sentinel stealth reconnaissance drone that had invaded Iran from Afghanistan, successfully seizing it with minimum damage. One day later, anonymous US officials revealed that the aircraft was operated by the CIA to surveil Iran's suspected nuclear facilities. The United States initially considered sending commandos or launching an airstrike to destroy the wreckage, but feared further escalations, hoping that the remains may never be found. Yet on December 8th, Iran's state television showcased the large drone almost intact. With the aircraft in the hands of Iranians, the American intelligence and analysts scrambled to explain how such an advanced drone could have fallen intact while rejecting Iran's claim of electronic warfare, proposing a wide range of scenarios from blaming the software and bad satellite connection to hardware, the mechanics of flight termination procedure, to human error mix-up between operators in launch and recovery protocols. A week after its televised display, the Iranian military provided its own technical explanation. In an interview with Christian Science Monitor, an anonymous engineer involved in the electronic ambush boasted that they first jammed drone satellite communication, forcing the aircraft into autopilot, and then exploited the drone's reliance on GPS, feeding fake coordinates to the aircraft as it had reached its home base in Afghanistan while being 300 kilometers inside Iran. Although the US satellite navigation experts ridiculed the engineer's claim, of course they did, they unanimously agreed that satellite communications and GPS navigations were well-known vulnerabilities. One of the structuring myths of drone warfare in military terms is its allowance to project power without projecting vulnerability, a myth that Gregory Chamel contends radically eliminates any immediate relation of reciprocity. Yet drone military proponents and its academic opponents both attest that failure is quite common in drone operations. In fact, the notion of failure occupies a privileged position within critical scholarship, where its instances brings the materiality of drone technology to the surface, exposing the human network of its robotic warfare. Yet the captured Sentinel, from the Iranian perspective, suggests that passive terms such as malfunctioning, failure, or accident do not sufficiently challenge the drone warfare's doctrine of projecting power without projecting vulnerability, as these terms presume the vulnerability to be caused internally. The framework of failure then reproduces what Achille Mbembe calls symbolics of the top, as even the power to produce vulnerability reestablishes vertical sovereignty. The emphasis on failure in the American media accounts of Sentinel didn't seek to explain the drone's downfall, but to deny the technological and military agency of Iranian forces to cause vulnerability and reciprocate drone warfare from the bottom. The most significant revelation in the Iranian engineer's interview, however, was not what tactics of electronic warfare they had used, rather how they had obtained such technological know-how. According to the engineer, the technique was developed through reverse engineering of previous American drones that Iran had captured. Since 2003, the United States had used its bases in neighboring countries to surveil Iran's possible nuclear activities. The drone's appearance on television audiovisually signaled Iran's intention to reverse engineer its latest prize. In that footage, the IRGC Aerospace Force commander, who was just killed in the latest Israel assault, he highlighted that some of the advanced sensor and radar technology inside are priceless, while another military personnel had its hands all over the airframe, gesturing these internals within arm's reach. In response to such a possibility, mainstream English media dedicated their platform to discussing what the Iranian military could possibly learn from the aircraft, unanimously claiming not so much. If the vertical sovereignty of the United States had humiliatingly come undone, the symbolics of the top had to be reestablished on a more fundamental level, racial superiority. Ridiculing Iran's promise of reverse engineering via titles such as "Defense experts are laughing the claim out of the room," and quoting from experts minimizing the loss as dropping a Ferrari into an ox cart technology culture, and saying that even dissecting the drone is above Iran's pay grade. Other analysts in the West all claim that only with the aid of Chinese or Russian experts, Iran may be able to crack the aircraft open. Such racism is not limited to security experts and media. Despite its proliferation across the Middle East in the past 2 decades, only a handful of works in the scholarship produced in English have considered any other military actors beside the United States and Israel. Even there, the usage of drones by non-state actors is framed as quote-unquote terrorist low-tech abuse of others' technological innovations. The work on state actors present the majority of Middle Eastern states as the customers of foreign military drones, their native programs as underdeveloped. It seems then the people of the Middle East, if not targets, can only be users of imported drone systems, never technologically capable of engineering warfare. Against such technological Orientalism, Shourouk El-Hariri puts forward the Arab history of technology as an emerging field that, quote, recognizes the agency of regions' people over their own material and technological history, end of quote. Understanding technology in the region not as a derivative of Western modernity or globalization, in this case, globalization of war, instead locally generated on our own term. The Iranian history of reverse engineering drones exemplifies such an on our own term. Although Iran's drone program traces back to the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, the IRGC's renewed investment in drone warfare in 2000 is grafted to the seized Israeli and American aircraft, beginning with an Israeli aircraft in 2000s and then followed up by 2 American reconnaissance drones that really pushed forward the process. After the capture of Sentinel, the IRGC gradually dissected and decoded the drone's hardware and software in the following months and years, accessing the component's diagnostic logs that exposed the drone's maintenance history in California, then decoding the footage from the hard drives showing US base at Kandahar airfield in Afghanistan. In 2014, the IRGC showcased the 1-to-1 and 40% scale reverse engineered airframes, and by 2017, the IRGC had launched a whole lineup of Shahed drones based on Sentinel, mass-producing smaller armed models. Far from being mere copies, the IRGC had re-engineered Sentinel according to the needs of its own extraterrestrial operations, as well as those of Iran's non-state and state partners, recirculating drone warfare across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Ukraine. Yet, Iran's reverse engineering drone warfare is shaped not only by global technology of aerial invasion, the foreign aircraft, but also global technology of ground blockade, the economic sanctions. In 2000s, through surrogate businesses in the Gulf and East Asia and intermediary firms in Europe, the IRGC managed to procure foreign electronic components and engines that didn't fall under the sanctions, yet were then reverse engineered and militarized in Iran by private companies and shell tech startups that constantly shapeshifted in response to each round of sanctions. In the past few years, forensic investigations of Iranian drones used by Russia in the invasion of Ukraine have uncovered that despite the US-led global sanctions, the majority of components are off-the-shelf commercial parts manufactured by American electronic companies, re-engineered into warfare technologies. Iran's rise into one of the major global exporters of drone warfare then is not despite US-led global economic sanctions, but precisely because of them. I will finish my presentation with this latest news that just recently, US Department of Defense unveiled its copy of Shahed drone because Donald Trump has favored its performance. And of course, this drone is not Iranian design either. Its history goes back to apartheid South Africa that was sold to Israel aerospace industry, developed into Harpy, then sold to Iran and turned into Shahed drones sold to Russia. So US, Israel, and Iran waged drone warfare against each other through the air by following each other's technological footsteps on the ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Saha. That was great. Our next presenter is Jomana Hamamdi, who has a master's degree in international studies from Birzeit. Jomana has worked in local media as a broadcaster and editor, and in public relations for several organizations. She currently works as a freelance journalist and analyst. And the paper Jomana Hamamdi is presenting today is titled Chinese-Israeli Military and Technical Cooperation, Implications for the US-Israeli Alliance. Jomana, the floor is yours.
شكرا ليزا. ورقتي مرحبا بكم جميعا. الشكر الجزيل لجامعة بيرزيت ولمعهد إبراهيم أبو العود على إتاحتهم الفرصة لنا للحديث عن هذه القضايا الهامة. رحم الله شهداءنا وشفى جرحانا وفك قيد أسرانا والفرج القريب لأهلنا في قطاع غزة الجريح. سلطت ورقتي البحثية الضوء على موضوع التعاون العسكري والتقني الصيني الإسرائيلي وتداعياته على التحالف الإسرائيلي الأمريكي. طبعا الصين تعتبر لاعب رئيسي في تمويل وبناء وتشغيل العديد من مشاريع البنية التحتية حول العالم، مثل الموانئ البحرية، المطارات، المستودعات والطرق السريعة وغيرها، بفضل مبادرة الحزام والطريق التي أطلقتها الصين عام 2013. هذه المبادرة جعلت من الصين توسع نفوذها اقتصادياً وسياسياً وتكنولوجياً وحتى جغرافياً بالمشاريع التي تربطها بأوروبا وأفريقيا والأمريكيتين عبر المحيط الهندي. هذا الأمر ساهم في زيادة قدرتها التنافسية الاستخباراتية والعسكرية. هذا أيضاً ينطبق على العلاقات الصينية الإسرائيلية التي بدأت تأخذ شكل المنفعة المتبادلة، حيث عملت الشركات الصينية على تنفيذ مشاريع كبرى في إسرائيل، لا سيما في تشغيل وتوسعة الموانئ البحرية. نذكر هنا مثال مثل ميناء حيفا، أيضاً ميناء أسدود، بالإضافة إلى بناء أنظمة نقل رئيسية مثل الأنفاق وخطوط السكك الحديدية في إسرائيل. في المجال العسكري أيضاً زادت وتيرة التعاون العسكري بين الصين وإسرائيل. طبعا في العقود الماضية شهدت صفقات أسلحة عديدة نفذت بين الطرفين، بدءا من توزيع أو تزويد إسرائيل للصين بمعدات تقنية متطورة، خاصة في المجال الإلكتروني مثل المشغل للطائرات بدون طيار وأيضا لتقنيات الرادار. طبعا هذا التعاون العسكري والتقني التكنولوجي بين إسرائيل والصين في طبيعة الحال أثار حفيظة وغضب الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية التي قابلت هذا التعاون بانتقادات شديدة بسبب مخاوفها من انتقال التقنيات العسكرية الحساسة إلى الصين، والتي تعتبرها الولايات المتحدة بأنها من شأنها أن تغير في موازين القوى القائمة. في البداية لو تتبعنا المراحل التاريخية للتعاون الصيني الإسرائيلي، لابد لنا أن نذكر بأنه إسرائيل هي أول دولة في الشرق الأوسط تعترف بجمهورية الصين الشعبية. كان ذلك في كانون الثاني من العام 1950. طبعا حاول الطرفان أنهم يتخذوا بعض الخطوات التجريبية من أجل إقامة علاقات دبلوماسية ما بينهم، ولكن هذه الجهود تعثرت لأنه كان في هذه الفترة الحرب الباردة، وما تبع هذه الحرب من ضغوطات مارستها الولايات المتحدة على إسرائيل من جهة، وعلى أيضا الدول العربية التي مارست ضغوطات من جهة أخرى على الصين. هذه الضغوطات أدت إلى تأجيل إقامة العلاقات الدبلوماسية الرسمية فيما بينهم حتى العام 1992، الذي ساهم في هذا العام أنه أصبح هناك تقارب وإقامة علاقات دبلوماسية ورسمية بين الطرفين. طبعا تبعوا توسيع علاقات اقتصادية بسرعة كبيرة من أجل تحقيق مصالح الطرفين الذاتية. على الرغم من أن الصين قبل أن تعزز علاقتها الدبلوماسية مع إسرائيل، لابد لنا من الإشارة إلى أنه واصلت الصين تعزيز علاقتها مع العالم العربي. في ستينيات القرن الماضي مثلا كان الطابع العدائي هو السائد على مواقف الصين الحكومية تجاه إسرائيل. الصين دعت منظمة التحرير الفلسطينية مثلا التي كانت حديثة النشأة آنذاك إلى فتح بعثة شبه دبلوماسية هي الأولى لها في دولة غير عربية. أيضا الصين دعت إلى تبني خيار المقاومة المسلحة في حل الصراع العربي الإسرائيلي، وأيضا الصراع الإسرائيلي الفلسطيني، حيث زودت مختلف الفصائل الفلسطينية آنذاك بالتدريب العسكري بالأسلحة المختلفة. ولكن حدث تغيير مفصلي في هذه العلاقة في أوائل السبعينيات من القرن الماضي، عندما حدثت المصالحة بين بكين وواشنطن التي أدت إلى قبول جمهورية الصين الشعبية في الأمم المتحدة كعضو دائم في مجلس الأمن. هذا جعل الصين توسع علاقاتها الخارجية وخاصة مع إسرائيل. بالنسبة للتعاون العسكري الإسرائيلي الصيني، هناك تقارير استخباراتية عديدة أشارت أنه في العقد الأخير من القرن الماضي كان هناك في عمليات تصدير لأنظمة تسليح ولتقنيات عسكرية من إسرائيل إلى الصين. هذه العمليات شملت تقنيات كان من الصعب على الصين أن تحصل عليها من الغرب بشكل مباشر، لأنه كان هناك حظر مفروض عليها في العام 1989. كان هناك أحداث شغب في الصين وتسببت بهذا الحظر، مثل إجراء تحسينات على طائرات ميغ 21 تكنولوجيا صواريخ جو أيضا. واستمرت إسرائيل في مواجهة التحديات الناجمة عن الحاجة لتحقيق توازن. يعني إسرائيل كانت دائما تحتاج لتحقيق توازن بين علاقتها الوثيقة مع الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وبين جهودها لبناء علاقة مع الصين. طبعا العلاقة العسكرية بين الصين وإسرائيل شهدت انتكاسة في بداية الألفية الثالثة، عندما رضخت إسرائيل للضغوطات الأمريكية في عام 2000 فيما يتعلق بإلغاء صفقة فالكون المتعلقة بتثبيت نظام الرادار الجوي المتطور على طائرات المراقبة التابعة لسلاح الجو الصيني. طبعا هذه الصفقة كان لها أثر دائم على العلاقات الصينية الإسرائيلية، لأنه يعني تابعها إجراء تغييرات في نظام مراقبة الصادرات الإسرائيلية بحجة مخاوف الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية المتزايدة من اكتساب الصين للسيطرة على المجال الجوي وترجيح ميزان القوى لصالح الصين في صراعها طبعا غير المعلن مع الولايات المتحدة، لا سيما فيما يتعلق بقضية تايوان. تبع ذلك في العام 2005 كانت هناك انتكاسة ثانية في هذا المجال، حيث تم التوافق بين الصين وإسرائيل على إجراء تحديثات وصيانة على أيدي خبراء إسرائيليين لطائرات هاربي المسيرة الصينية التي باعتها لها إسرائيل في تسعينيات القرن الماضي. طبعا هذا الإجراء أثار غضب الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية بشكل كبير، لأن الولايات المتحدة اكتشفت بأن صيانة هذه الطائرات ستشمل ليس فقط الصيانة وإنما أيضا تحديثات عليها، فسارعت الولايات المتحدة لاتهام إسرائيل بخداعها بشأن طبيعة العمل. ما جعلها توقف تعاونها مع إسرائيل، وهو إجراء عقابي من الولايات المتحدة التي أوقفت تعاونها مع إسرائيل في برنامج مقاتلة F-35 المشتركة. طبعا هذه الأزمة بين الولايات المتحدة وإسرائيل أدت إلى قطع العلاقات الدفاعية بين إسرائيل والصين وإجراء تغييرات كبيرة في هيكل نظام المراقبة على الصادرات الإسرائيلية. هذا يدل على النفوذ الأمريكي الكبير وعلى السيطرة الأمريكية على القرار الإسرائيلي المتعلق بالسياسة الخارجية الإسرائيلية تجاه العالم، وخاصة الصين التي تعتبرها الولايات المتحدة هي المنافس الأقوى لها في على صعيد النظام الدولي. هي تحاول يعني إسرائيل تحاول الاستفادة اقتصاديا واستراتيجيا وتقنيا من علاقتها الوثيقة مع الصين، ولكن أيضا في نفس الوقت تحاول موازنة هذه العلاقة مع علاقتها العضوية مع الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية. القوات المسلحة الصينية بالتزامن مع هذا ومنذ سنوات طويلة طبعا سعت إلى بناء إمبراطورية اقتصادية تحتوي على العديد من الصناعات العسكرية التي تطمح في تصديرها للعالم. مثلا منذ نهاية القرن الماضي صممت الصين أشكال متنوعة لطائراتها عفوا الحربية بالتعاون مع روسيا وإسرائيل. خططت وقتها ليدخل في العام 2006 إلى الخدمة حوالي 150 قاذفة من طراز سوخوي 27 المصنوعة في الصين بتصريح روسي، إلى جانب الطائرات المهاجمة طبعا FB7 من الإنتاج الصيني وغيرها من الأسلحة. طبعا إسرائيل تدرك مقدار حاجتها للصين ومقدار حاجة الصين لها لتطوير قدراتها العسكرية، وأيضا إسرائيل تحتاج الصين كونها يعني هي عبارة عن سوق هائل للشركات المتخصصة بالصناعات العسكرية داخل إسرائيل، ولكن هي في نفس الوقت تحاول ضبط عملية تصدير العسكري الصيني لأطراف تعتبر معادية لإسرائيل. وهذا ما أعلن عنه صراحة وزير الخارجية الإسرائيلي الأسبق دافيد ليفي، الذي قال إن أحد أهم أهداف العلاقات الدبلوماسية بين الصين وإسرائيل هو عقد اتفاقية مع الصين لمراقبة الأسلحة التي ترسلها إلى الشرق الأوسط، وأنها بلغتها قلقة إزاء إمكانية بيع صواريخ بعيدة المدى لإيران وسوريا التي تعتبرها إسرائيل معادية لها. هناك يعني مخاوف من الثغرات الأمنية التي طبعا الولايات المتحدة وإسرائيل يعني أبرزت خشيتها من هذه الثغرات التي حددت في منتجات العديد من شركات التكنولوجيا الصينية التي تستثمر في إسرائيل. فمثلا وجد أنه متصفح شركات التكنولوجيا الصينية العملاقة مثل تنسنت وعلي بابا وبايدو تنقل بيانات شخصية مثل إحداثيات نظام تحديد المواقع العالمي GPS وعناوين المواقع التي تمت زيارتها ونقاط وصول واي فاي ومعرفات الأجهزة الفريدة، أيضا إما بتشفير ضعيف أو بدون تشفير. كمان احتوت هذه المتصفحات على ثغرات أمنية يمكن استغلالها لتثبيت برامج ضارة على أجهزة المستخدمين، وطبعا أرسلت أجهزة شاومي بيانات المستخدمين إلى خوادم في الصين بدون إذن. هذا مثال على الثغرات الأمنية. لذلك هناك مخاوف إسرائيلية وأمريكية من الاستثمارات الصينية في إسرائيل، وخاصة في ميناء حيفا النموذج الذي يعد مثال بارز على تعقيدات العلاقة الثلاثية بين إسرائيل والولايات المتحدة والصين، لأنه ترسو في هذا الميناء سنويا وحدات من الأسطول السادس الأمريكي لأسباب استراتيجية. طبعا أهم هذه الأسباب المشاركة في المناورة البحرية المشتركة جونبر كوبرا التي تعقد كل عامين، ولتقديم الدعم لنظام الدفاع الصاروخي البالستي بأمدي لحماية إسرائيل من التهديدات الصاروخية الإقليمية. تتمركز بشكل دائم هذه السفن الأمريكية في شرق البحر الأبيض المتوسط أو بالقرب منه من أجل تعزيز الدفاع الصاروخي الإسرائيلي عبر الدعم البحري. هذا التعاون الإسرائيلي الصيني الذي أدى إلى تشغيل ميناء حيفا طبعا أدى إلى إثارة نقاشات حادة بين صناع القرار في واشنطن وتل أبيب فيما ينظر إلى الميناء باعتباره مرفق حيوي للعمليات العسكرية الأمريكية. هناك احتمالية، هذا ما تخشاه الولايات المتحدة، أن تستخدم الشركات الصينية العاملة فيه لجمع معلومات استخباراتية في هذا الميناء طبعا، وفي حال وجود مؤشرات على أن هذه الشركات توفر للصين فرص لجمع بيانات أمنية حساسة قد تضطر الولايات المتحدة إلى إعادة تقييم توازنها بين مصالحها الدفاعية في المنطقة والمخاطر الناجمة عن الوجود الصيني في البنى التحتية الحيوية. طبعا هناك معلومات كثيرة في هذا الخصوص، ولكن لضيق الوقت نأخذ يعني ما هو الجزئية الأهم في هذا الموضوع. يتضح من تحليل العلاقة الصينية الإسرائيلية أن هذا التعاون متعدد الأبعاد يجمع المصالح الاقتصادية والتكنولوجية والعسكرية. الصين تسعى لتعزيز نفوذها العالمي عبر مشاريع البنية التحتية والاستثمار في التكنولوجيا، بينما تستفيد أيضا إسرائيل في المقابل من التمويل والأسواق الصينية. مع ذلك هذا التقارب مثل ما قلنا يثير مخاوف جدية لدى الولايات المتحدة، هي الحليف الاستراتيجي الأهم لإسرائيل لما يحمله من تهديدات محتملة للأمن السبراني ونقل التكنولوجيا الحساسة. فتجد إسرائيل نفسها أمام هذا الواقع في موقع دقيق تحاول فيه تحقيق مكاسب من علاقتها مع الصين دون الإضرار بتحالفها الحيوي مع واشنطن. فهذه العلاقة هي واحدة من أكثر الملفات حساسية في السياسة الدولية المعاصرة. وشكرا للجميع.
Thank you so much, Jumana. And our next and final speaker today is Pablo Ruiz, who is a journalist and human rights defender. He's a member of the Observatory for the Closure of the School of the Americas in Chile. And the paper he's presenting today is titled U.S. Military Training and Its Impact on Human Rights from the Perspective of Colombia. What standards do we need? Pablo, the floor is yours.
Lisa, may I just say something
Yes.
for interpretation purposes?
Yes.
So Pablo, because we couldn't assign the Spanish channel for some reason, we have the interpreter Hazim here. He will like listen to Pablo and translate live, not on the channel, the Spanish channel, because we're having some issues with the Spanish channel. Pablo, perdón, pero lo que pasa es que bueno, la traducción al español es un poquito, bueno, la canal no funciona, no sé por qué. Entonces, tenemos la persona que va a traducir aquí, él va a traducir después de ti. Entonces, no sé si hablas como 4 minutos, por ejemplo, él va a traducir en inglés y después seguimos. Perdónanos por este, por este problema. ¿Está bien contigo?
Está bien conmigo.
Bueno,
Intentaré ser breve
sí.
ante esta situación.
Perdón y lo arreglamos mañana.
Primero,
Perdón. Gracias.
bueno, gracias. Primero, manifestar nuestra solidaridad con Palestina. Vengo a poner el tema del entrenamiento militar de los Estados Unidos. En este caso, la Comisión de la Verdad de Colombia, que terminó su trabajo en el 2022, registró que en Colombia hubo más de 450.000 muertos. En total, hubo más de 9 millones de víctimas. El 90% de esas víctimas son civiles y solamente 10% actores armados. Las Fuerzas Armadas de Colombia recibieron entrenamiento en los Estados Unidos. La Comisión de la Verdad de Colombia estableció que Colombia tuvo relaciones con los Estados Unidos, fundamentalmente en la construcción del modelo de seguridad que imperó en Colombia. Y Colombia aceptó el marco discursivo, primero la guerra contra el comunismo, segundo la guerra contra las drogas y tercero la guerra contra el terrorismo. Entonces, el modelo colombiano es un modelo contrainsurgente, antidrogas y antiterrorista según las políticas de los Estados Unidos.
Basil, are you doing translation?
Okay, no, I was waiting for Hazim, who's okay. He still has having an issue. Okay, so Pablo, ¿puedes regresar a otro slide? A la primera. Okay, so Pablo, Maher, you can take from me. Pablo was saying that the military training between the United States and its impact on the human rights from the perspective of Colombia. That's the broader kind of title of the talk. According to the report in 2022 discussing the Colombian conflict, it cites a figure of 450,000 deaths in addition to 121,000 forced disappearances because of the armed conflict, in addition to 50,000 people who were kidnapped, 16,000 children and adults who were also recruited by armed actors, in addition to nearly 8 million people displaced people. This report estimates around 9 million victims, 90% of which are civilian victims and 10% are armed actors. Pablo, si podemos ir a la siguiente, por favor. And Pablo was discussing, of course, the relation between the United States and Colombia, arguing that kind of the Colombian model of the United States model of security had been kind of visible in Colombia, in a sense as if the Colombian regime had assumed this United States model of counterterrorism, kind of centered around this quote unquote war on drugs. Two things here, just to kind of quickly mention. He says that the doctrine, the counterinsurgent doctrine, is central to this counterinsurgent doctrine is the idea of the internal enemy, the enemigo interno, and the privatization of security, in addition to the military assistance by the United States. Podemos seguir ahorita, Pablo. Gracias.
Gracias. El entrenamiento de los Estados Unidos entre el año 99 y el 2018 dio entrenamiento a 110.000 militares colombianos. Una gran cantidad de estos militares fueron entrenados en la Escuela de la América. El diario The New York Times en el año 96 denunció la existencia de 7 manuales de entrenamiento, los que aconsejaban aplicar tortura, chantaje, extorsión y pago por enemigos muertos. Los ejemplos más claros son las ejecuciones extrajudiciales, donde varios de los implicados fueron entrenados en los Estados Unidos.
Okay, so this is specifically about the military training of Colombian forces by the United States. Between 1998 to 2018, the United States trained over 110,000 military personnel, 19,000 of which were specifically trained in the School of the Americas between the period 1946 until 2020. And a North American press agency cited 7 manuals that were produced as a manual to train military personnel in using methods of torture, of extortion, as well as how to kind of use these violent methods in Colombia and other places.
La Comisión de la Verdad, en sus recomendaciones final, recomendó al Estado y al Congreso de Colombia que se adopte una nueva visión de seguridad para la paz y con un enfoque en la seguridad humana. Y también recomendó que se sometan los acuerdos de cooperación internacional a procedimientos de debate público, y en particular que se debe someter el estudio en cuanto al otorgamiento de la inmunidad a agentes extranjeros que pudieran estar implicados en violación a los derechos humanos.
Okay, so this Truth Commission report recommended, in addition to other items, that the national government and the Republic and the Congress in Colombia that adopts a new vision of security that produces or that seeks to produce peace that centers around human security, and as well as dealing with the immunity that was offered to foreigners who were involucrated and involved in violations of human rights in Colombia.
Colombia, Chile, Israel también reciben entrenamiento en los Estados Unidos. Entonces, ¿qué pedimos? ¿Cuáles son los estándares y normas que los países del mundo deberían aplicar? Primero, las Fuerzas Armadas deben ser educadas bajo los pilares de los derechos humanos y el derecho internacional humanitario. Y segundo, se debe prohibir el entrenamiento militar en países que no respetan los derechos humanos, como Estados Unidos e Israel, que también da entrenamiento a tropas latinoamericanas. Solamente voy a mencionar estos dos puntos para que avancemos en este webinario.
Bueno, gracias. The United States not only trains Colombia, but Colombian and Chilean and Israeli militaries. And so what are the standards and norms that should be followed to ensure that this does not take place? So one of the ideas that had been cited here is to educate the armed forces of the pillars of human rights and international human rights, as well as prohibiting the foreign military training in countries that do not respect human rights. Pablo says that he will stick to these 2 points. I actually missed the second point, so I translated the other one, just for the sake of time and moving forward.
Bueno, para terminar, este uniforme 2022 y 2023, donde figura que Colombia envió en el 2022 y el 2023, siguió enviando tropas de entrenamiento a los Estados Unidos. Y este otro muestra que Israel envía soldados israelíes a diversos programas de entrenamiento en los Estados Unidos.
So these are tables attesting to the sending of Israeli and Colombian forces to the United States for being trained in military tactics and and receiving military training, and the values of each of these programs.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. And I really appreciate you too, Basil, for stepping in to do translation. So if anyone has questions, please put it into the Q&A function in the bottom. But while we're waiting, I thought that I would just make a few sort of points or questions to our speakers. I think that a lot of these papers really hang together and make very important contributions. And I would say I personally feel like I've benefited a lot because I've been looking, in my own research recently, sort of culminating on many, several decades of research on the war on terror and even longer on Israel and Palestine, particularly Tabinda and Iman's papers, the cohesiveness of them. One thing I've been thinking about is what I call the Guantanamo phenomenon. And in that sense, my research has been mainly focused on detention, forced disappearance, and torture. But I think a lot of the driving ideology, that Tabinda is talking about with the monsterization of Muslims, in order to justify indiscriminate killing and the justification of violence. And also for Iman, the notion of like this, I think the phrasing that you used was benevolent cruelty or something to that extent, where that this Israeli government's perception of its own security needs legitimizes, psyops and all kinds of other things. But one question I wanted to ask, maybe address a question to Tabinda, because it's thinking about it, you're talking about how, racism and racialization are so crucial to this monsterization. One of the things that, like I've been trying, and especially because you link it to political science, I've been trying to think about, and I wonder if it's something that resonates with you, that how do we get our academic colleagues, to the plea that you issue in your paper that political science should abandon this kind of discourse. In my own thinking, I try to emphasize that, policy in these wars on terror is literally the wedding of ignorance and hubris. Where governments don't know what the hell they're doing, but they have the sense that we know all. And then it's because of this racialized monsterization that anything and anybody can be killed. But I mean, if we emphasize, the ignorance that lies at the heart of the national security vision, do you think that that would have any impact on academic discourse?
I'm thinking like I don't have an easy answer to that question, because like on one hand there's ignorance, but it's led to like really bloated executives, this war on terror in the United States itself, as well as it like filters down throughout the world, right? It's given states unprecedented power, emergency powers, exception, powers of, suspending human rights because of like situations of exception. And so in that sense, there's ignorance of the state, but there's also ignorance of like citizens about what the state is doing, because it creates a justification for intelligence agencies, because it's primarily a war against, like a covert war, right? With like intelligence agencies leading. So on one hand, the state is ignorant, but on the other hand, the citizens are also ignorant of what the state is doing, right? And the state is justified in not telling citizens for national security reasons. So I think that's like a double danger. In terms of academics, like if it would help academic discourse, I don't see how we could. I feel that the concept itself, other than resisting the concept, because like the concept itself creates a justification for ignorance, because we're not allowed to know what they don't know themselves, right?
But I mean, yeah, I think that one of the things that at least, I mean, it's something I'm constantly, dealing with, and I think this also applies to Soha's paper, is like actually foreground how ignorant the policymakers and the academics who kind of, allow the reverberation of their things. I mean, I'm just wondering if, highlighting their ignorance as a core element would be useful. Let me just move through, and then we have one question for Jumana, but Iman, your paper, I think, not only in the framework that you use, but also in the examples that you give about the, how you analyze the pagers as kind of like, post-sniper, almost like the idea that it's such an indiscriminate way of operating, and the various other policies of cruelty. I don't really have a question so much as I would say that the work that you're doing, that, invoking Jasbir Puar on maiming and, other things, but it also makes me think that the theoretical analysis, so you don't really cite in your paper Gregoire Chamieux, a theory of the drone, but I think that this idea of how violence operates in this asymmetric and boundless way may be very useful because I really feel like your sort of invoking of cruelty is really a theoretical contribution. I mean, many people talk about cruelty, but you're really doing an analysis, wedding it to very empirical realities. So I just wanted to say, if you want to respond to that, but it's not really a question. You're muted.
Thank you so much. I'm actually unaware of this theory. I will say this paper was very much experimental for me, just because I don't really dabble with technology. But just because it continued to surface and continues to surface in my research, I thought, okay, this is something that I need to write about. And so I'm very much new to the literature. So thank you so much. I noted that.
Okay, and then sort of on technology, Soha, your paper, and for I think hopefully we are going, Basil and I and maybe others will be hoping to put together an edited volume coming out of this conference. I mean, everyone's paper is worth reading, but I think Soha's in particular, I was very excited to read about it. But the thing that you emphasize, and I think it also relates to this hubris and ignorance, is the way in which it's the racism of as you'd call it, the presumptions of racial technological illiteracy, and that's the ignorance, and then the hubris is the myth of invulnerability. I think that those sort of frameworks really resonate. Is there some sense that you could maybe make a comment or two about where, beyond this paper itself, your research is going around the themes that you've addressed in the paper you presented today?
Sure. I think of course this is part of my dissertation. In a sense, I think one of the engaging very much with both sort of especially drone scholarship and cyber scholarship, there are so many gaps in the ways that in academic ways people have discussed and thought about drone, in a sense that there are many things that these kind of assumptions that, of course, many of which boils down to racism, kind of ignorance, and in a sense a kind of very much US centrism, really does not is not able to really explain the drone warfare and what is happening on the ground, in a sense that the drone can be opened. It includes so many pieces that then we have to be able to trace where these material components are coming from. I think the one of the things that I still cannot wrap my head around is that there is a lot written about drone operations, but not production. And I think that is a crucial way of, because on another level, that lack of attention to the production also leads to the way that we as scholars in US academia are not able to challenge the conditions of our workplace, that for example, how much our universities are directly tied to the military, how we can demilitarize. And so I think that part is where I'm trying to intervene, in a sense that we need to take seriously the production, the material production, and most importantly, letting go of the consumption, the assumption that it is as if there is kind of a logic of arms race. It is for me. It is not. It is the economy of war. It is a global economy of war that does not have any distinctions between. And of course, it does have a distinction between Israel, United States, and Iran, but they are all functioning and benefiting by engineering this destruction. And I think we need to address that core problem of war capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about, the assumptions that Iran couldn't possibly re-engineer the drone technology was the presumption of the illegibility of the high technology of the United States and other states, and it's been proven wrong. Okay, so there's a question here for Jomana, which is one that I was very close to what I would have asked. The question from Eichert is, what are the prospects of China severing trade and military ties with Israel? What consequences would it have, especially for China? How have relations between the two countries changed after October 7th? And I would just add, my point is, you in your paper, you talk a lot about those kind of trade relations. I'm wondering if you could say something about how the discourse of normalization or anti-normalization plays out in China, because it seems like China's you know, it's not personal, it's just business. Where I can make money, we're going to make money regardless. But yeah, so that's would be my question. The question here is there any prospect for change in relations? And how do the politics of normalization or anti-normalization play out within a Chinese context?
يعني أنا أعتبر وأعتقد أنه تأثر العلاقات بين الصين وإسرائيل هناك احتمال ضعيف لتأثر هذه العلاقات الاقتصادية والعسكرية وغيرها لعدة أسباب، منها المصالح الاقتصادية الكبرى، لأن الصين مثل ما ذكرت في الورقة تستثمر مليارات الدولارات في مشاريع البنية التحتية داخل إسرائيل مثل ميناء حيفا، ميناء أسدود والعديد من المشاريع الأخرى. أيضا شركات التكنولوجيا الإسرائيلية توفر للصين مدخل إلى الابتكارات الغربية التي هي كانت ممنوعة عن الصين من قبل الغرب. إسرائيل تعد الصين هي جسر مهم في أو إسرائيل تعد جسر مهم في مشروع الحزام والطريق الصيني، وبالتالي هناك احتمالات ضعيفة جدا لتأثر العلاقات الصينية الإسرائيلية بسبب لأي سبب، سواء كان 7 أكتوبر أو غيره، لأنه أيضا الصين لا ترغب في تصعيد التوتر ما بينها وبين إسرائيل وما بينها وبين الغرب، لأن إسرائيل هو واجهة للغرب في المنطقة، وهي يعني حذرة في هذا المجال، ولديها مخاوف وتخشى بأنه تتحول إسرائيل إلى ورقة ضغط جديدة ضدها أمام الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية. أيضا هناك ميزة في السياسة الصينية الخارجية، هي سياسة الحياد وعدم التدخل، حتى في المواقف الدامية مثل 7 أكتوبر. تبقي الصين دائما على لهجة دبلوماسية، لهجة حوارية، تحاول أن تلعب دور الوسيط في هذه الصراعات والخلافات، وتحاول الحفاظ على توازن علاقاتها سواء مع الشرق الأوسط أو مع الغرب. هناك عواقب كبيرة على الصين إذا قطعت علاقاتها مع إسرائيل، لأنه قطع العلاقات هذا ممكن أن يضعف من وجودها في منطقة الشرق الأوسط، التي تعتبرها الصين طبعا منطقة استراتيجية وهامة من الناحية الجيوسياسية لها، وهي تركز على الجانب الاقتصادي دائما في سياستها الخارجية. هذا الذي يعني يعتبر كبوصلة لها في تعاملها مع الدول الأخرى. ولكن يعني لابد من الإشارة أنه علاقة الصين مع إسرائيل ليس يعني لا يمكن أن نقول أنه تغيرت، ولكن اختلفت اللهجة أو صعدت الصين لهجتها بعد 7 أكتوبر، لأنها أدانت القوة المفرطة التي تستخدمها إسرائيل في قطاع غزة وفي الضفة الغربية. دائما كان هناك قرار في مجلس الأمن من الصين بوقف، هي مع وقف إطلاق النار، ودائما تشدد على ضرورة حل الدولتين، تدخل بالوساطة سواء في المصالح الداخلية الفلسطينية أو في أي توترات خارجية. وهناك تصاعد للغضب الشعبي داخل الصين ضد ما يجري في المنطقة، لا سيما في منصات التواصل الاجتماعي. طبعا نرصد هذا التصاعد في الغضب، وهناك تعليق لبعض المشاريع غير المعلنة جمدت، ولكن لا نقول أنها توقفت، وتحاول أن تكون على تقارب أكبر مع العالم الإسلامي والعربي المحيط بها.
Thank you. We have a question for Tabinda, but before that, I just wanted to direct a question to Pablo. Pablo, one of the things, you know, and thank you for your work on trying to close the School of the Americas. One question I have that your paper made me think about is the kind of swinging from left to right of various Latin American governments, you know, from Brazil, you know, from Bolsonaro to Lula, you know, in Chile, now there's, you know, a leftist government, you know, a very right-wing government in Argentina. How do these swinging, you know, ideological positions of the different governments affect the activism focused specifically on the School of the Americas or more broadly on human rights, you know, within the region itself? itself across borders? How does that, how do you find that playing out?
Ok, esta pregunta es para Pablo. Y Pablo, Lisa te preguntó sobre el giro de izquierda a derecha de varios gobiernos latinoamericanos, como por ejemplo en Argentina esa gira hacia la derecha, en otros países hacia la izquierda. ¿Cómo usted piensa afecta estas como diferentes modos de gobiernos de derecha y de izquierda al activismo centrado contra la Escuela de las Américas y también más amplio en el activismo por los derechos humanos en Latinoamérica?
Los cambios de gobierno en la práctica no afectan en nada con lo que tiene que ver el tema del entrenamiento. Estados Unidos es muy pragmático. Se siguen enviando tropas de Colombia, de Chile, ahora de Argentina a la Escuela de las Américas. Entonces, sean de derecha o sean de izquierda, el poder que tiene Estados Unidos para imponer su agenda militar es insuperable. Entonces, no hay tantos cambios, sean de izquierda o de derecha, los gobiernos se siguen enviando tropas de entrenamiento y se siguen haciendo ejercicios militares en América Latina.
So the change of government in relation to military training changes nothing, as Pablo mentioned. The United States continue to send trainers to Chile and to Argentina, as he had mentioned, and to other parts of Latin America. So whether the governments are left or right, nothing has actually changed. The policy is central to the United States.
Okay, thank you. And I think we're almost running out of time, but I am going to give Rinda Saleh, who asked a question for Tabinda. It'll be the last question. And the question is, this discourse in relation to terrorism among political science academics is not only on the level of academics from the global north, but it is also followed by academics in the global south, unfortunately. In light of the power over knowledge production, mainly in the West to the rest of the world, how would such discourse be opposed with limited opportunities for the academics from the global south, mainly regarding knowledge production, research, publishing, etc., considering knowledge as power and the concept of coloniality of power? There's a whole system that enables such specific knowledge production.
Yeah, it's a really difficult question. I read it 5 minutes ago and I'm still thinking about, what would be the way, because it really is a systemic problem. And I sort of noticed it both as a graduate student in America, because we have to situate our research in debates, and the debates are among Western academics. So particularly studying Islam and Sharia and democracy, it's because the, Western academic disciplines have been created according to Western social and political history, right? So now they've created that disciplinary division. Within those disciplines, there are like branches of debates that are very, very fine debates. And the question I was studying, it cut across all these disciplines and the debates. So there's no exact place to situate a debate. So I had this research I did 10 years ago, and it just recently got published in the Journal of Islamic Law at Harvard Law School, right? When I did it, basically, I feel like at one level, it's a decision as an individual according to your own conscience about what is academia, right? Like for me personally, academia entails emotional attachment and commitment to a society and a particular ethical vision for social justice, right? I never bought into this in American political science and economics especially. They try to create this idea of value neutral objectives, whatever, positivist scholarship, which I think is basically enabling of the status quo in the American empire.
Right.
It justifies capitalism and it justifies imperialism and it invisibilizes colonialism. Those are the things that it was doing. And in order to be a successful academic, I really would have had to internalize that discourse and then locate myself in a debate within it, which anyway, so I decided personally, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to go back to my country. I'll join a political movement. I felt that we can generate more honest scholarship if we're connected to our societies, right? So the problem is I did see the question that was asked. Her name is Rina? I can't see her.
Rinda Saleh.
Rinda Saleh. So the question that Rinda asked, it's a very accurate description, because ultimately it is a question of resources, that universities in the global south do not have the resources to fully challenge. And there is a huge incentive for conformity, because in order to be successful, so even an academic in the global south, if they're in the Anglophone sphere, they would want to be successful in the West, right? The highest universities in the West. And that creates this pressure towards conformity. So being in Pakistan and in a Pakistani university, I actually found it more difficult to share my research on Sharia, because I felt there was more conformity to Western discourse. And as far as terrorism is concerned, like even in a place like Pakistan, I think people still do produce critical scholarship on it in a private university that's funded by capitalists. But then, like, I'm thinking of LUMS in Lahore, but basically, like, that's all in English, right? So all of that English scholarship, it's such a small minority of the country that the military doesn't really care. They're like, whatever, you don't affect anybody, and you're not connected to anybody, so you don't influence, these movements. So it can exist in very small spheres, but then there are like tiers of academia, right? There's this private capitalist funded universities that operate in English and are in conversation with American universities at the highest levels. The second tier is all public universities that are also in English, but the people's first language is not English. So there's a foreign language problem as well. So the conformity pressure becomes greater, the lower is the power of academics, in that global system. So anyway, so the answer, that's why I've come to Mexico, because Mexico has enough power and enough independence to allow scholarship that is critical of, American imperialism, and also doesn't have, I didn't find like prejudices towards Muslims or Sharia or, preconceived political things. So my very brief answer to her would be that at one level, it's an individual decision according to your conscience, but at a second level, it's also about academics organizing outside of institutions, developing networks that connect like South academics to like critical academics in the global North. So like networks and their own publications, because we can't share that independent and critical knowledge if we don't have a journal, that's going to publish it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. So I think just to sort of sum that up, and I think it's a good sort of concluding point that like this, the South and critical approaches. So just for example, there's a whole discourse now, very exciting, called Third World Approaches to International Law, or TWAIL. But I would just say, having started my academic career as a political scientist and then realized like, no, thank you, that discourse, for people who want to have a more welcoming, open, critical sort of home base, whether you're in the North or the global South, sociology, anthropology, film and media studies. So if you're a graduate student and you're thinking about what to study, there's political science, and then there's the good disciplines. Okay, that's it for our panel. I really want to thank Tabinda, Iman, Soha, Jomana, and Pablo. I want to thank the translators, including Basil Faraj, who was recruited to that, and thank the organizers for this conference. Tomorrow, there's one more set of sessions that will all be online. So thank you all very much.